Good morning, everybody, both at the Hardware Center and for those online. My name is Dylan. I own a company called Ply Creations. I am a furniture designer and maker who hasn't made a piece of furniture in the last year and a half. So my business is now moving much more towards training, and together with the Hardware Center, who has graciously allowed me to use their facilities, moving a lot more in my business, I'm moving into training. So for the guys online, again, welcome to joining us here today. Today we'll be covering the basics of hand sharpening your own tools. So we'll be going through the preparation of how to prep a blade, bevel angles, why you would consider different bevel angles, and then we go into the techniques of getting a blade sharp. And hopefully towards the end of today, I'll be doing a demonstration using some diamond stones and a funky little kit that is available from Axminster Tools that the guys from Hardware Center should be able to source for you if you are interested. They've given it to me to evaluate, and I've written both detailed articles around the review on the product, but I'll give you a little bit more information around that. So again, welcome, especially to everybody that took the trouble and made the effort to be here today. Good morning. You may notice on the table there behind you, they've packed out their sharpening stones and their diamond stones. Hardware Center has offered for today only a 15% discount on all their diamond stones. And as we discuss and go through the process of the hand sharpening and we cover different techniques and methodologies, I'll tell you what I use. I use diamond stones and why I prefer diamond stones of all the options that you have available to you. So we can discuss that in a little bit more detail as we go along. Then as well, for the guys online, if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the comment section. We'll answer them as best we can. And communicate with us via the comment section. But welcome to everybody again, and let's get going. Just show of hands. Who regularly sharpens their own hand tools? Yeah, even the guys who know what they're doing will go like this. Okay, guys, one thing to understand about hand sharpening your own tools is it's not an exact science, and this usually makes the engineers among my students a little bit uncomfortable. Okay, it's not an exact science, and often it's either a thumb suck or somewhere in the ballpark. And the frightening, or one of the most frightening statements to make along with that is the same goes for woodworking. Okay, it's not precision engineering, and a certain level of, let's say, leeway is sometimes acceptable, and if leeway doesn't work, there's always clamping pressure to fall back on and keep everything together until the glue sets, and then you hope and pray that everything stays as it should in time. Don't worry, it probably will outlast you, so when it breaks, you won't be here anymore to explain or having to fix it. But sharpening very much is an exact but inexact science, and you need to hit certain parameters to be able to get a blade sharp. The visual still okay, Jordan? Okay. So for the online guys and everybody here, I'm going to be using the whiteboard. Almost thought that I lost the pen. I'll be using the whiteboard to explain many of the concepts that we will be working on. And please, guys, feel free to ask me any question if anything is unclear. I've been doing this for a while, so what happens in the case where we've become familiar with certain aspects within our pastimes is we tend to glance over certain aspects. So please stop me, feel free to stop me, and let's have a discussion around aspects that you may or may not understand so I can clarify those for you. Okay, each one of you would have gotten a little page just with the information that we'll be covering today. And today we start with what is sharp. Okay, we may get into the rabbit hole of what is sharp enough. But what is sharp to start off with? Now, be it a knife, be it your chisel, be it a hand plane, be it a thicknesser planer that uses blades. Anything that uses a blade, what defines sharp? So the sharpness is defined by when two planes come together in an acute point. Okay, that's sharpness. And the more acute you can get that area there, the sharper your blade is. Now, there's quite a few ways in getting those two planes to meet one another in an acute a way as possible. One of the easiest way to do that is grit. So when you sharpen and you use your sharpening tools, the higher you go up in grit, the more atoms, if you will, you remove so that those two planes come together, and the more acute they come together, the cleaner they come together, the sharper your tool is going to be. Okay? Relatively obvious. Now, what's really, really important is how you get to a sharp point, first of all, and then from a woodworking perspective, probably need to draw that again. These angles, what should they be, why they are important, okay, and what the best ways are of establishing those bevels to give you the sharpest edge possible. And that sort of leads us in to a discussion around, so what is sharp enough? Okay. You will see on the internet and some YouTube channels where many will profess that this grit that you sharpen at needs to be as high as you can possibly get it, and many will sharpen up to a grit of 15, 20,000 grit. Now, when we talk about grit, we're talking about an abrasive that has particles in it that abrades metal away. Remember, I am sharpening, when I'm sharpening, I'm taking away from that plane, and I'm also taking away from that plane so that I bring them in line with one another so that I have a sharp edge. And that is done by an abrasive material. Now, how coarse or fine that abrasive material is quoted as a grit. Just to make our life as woodworkers much more complicated than it necessarily needs to be, Hardware Center stocks Easy Lap. Easy Lap's grits of coarse, fine, and medium is Easy Lap's grits of coarse, fine, and medium. If you happen to be using a DMT diamond stone, DMT's diamond stone, coarse, fine, medium, is different than Easy Lap's. So there's no consistent standards around what those grits mean for each manufacturer. There is hope after all. If you sign up for my newsletter and I have your contact details, what I can do is I can send an email out to everybody with a link to Veritas. Actually has a very nice comparative, comparative spreadsheet where they take all the major manufacturers and they say Easy Lap, these are their stones, DMT, these are their stones, and those are the stated grits. These are the micron measurements of the abrasive material, because that is the only, what's the correct word, subjective measurement that indicates how coarse or fine a stone will be. So they actually state the micron grits on the stones, and then you can have a direct comparison about which manufacturer's stone falls within which level of abrasiveness, and then they even help you more by suggesting what you use each different grit for. So it's quite a useful spreadsheet to have, and I can share that with you guys as well. So that sort of complicates our life. So the argument is that the finer the grit is, the more acute that angle becomes. But we also work in a world of diminishing returns. I use a strop with honing compound in. It goes up to very fine grit, and cost effectively, that's probably the best option if you want to go up and higher grits. And we'll discuss this in a little bit more detail when we get to the systems. Or you can get a ceramic stone. Rob Cosman is especially popular for the fact that he uses ceramic stones. He never uses a strop. So he goes up to a certain high level of ceramic stone, and then he planes directly off the stone. He doesn't go to a strop. Other guys will believe to use a strop or don't use a strop. Ceramic stones get ridiculously expensive. So cost effectively, this is your cheapest option. It really just costs you an Afrikaans here, ons 'n vel. So it's a sheet of leather, you stick it to MDF, and you're ready to go. And of course you load that with the honing compound, but we'll cover that in more detail a little bit later. So that brings you up to the higher grit. But at which point is it sharp enough? Paul Sellers actually has a nice video where he only sharpens up to 400 grit, and then he shows you how the plane works at that particular grit. Guys, keep in mind that diamond stones is a modern invention, let's say the last 15 years. Commercially available at a cost-effective price the last 5 years. Even before then, diamond stones were very expensive. So what did the guys use to sharpen their blades? Oil stones or Arkansas stones. Okay? Those pieces of furniture that they made using those grits are well finished, and they stand in a museum. Okay? Well finished, and let's call it socially acceptable. May not be acceptable to an engineer's level of standard of woodworking, but acceptable. If I plane a surface, I finish all my pieces with a hand plane. I hardly ever sand. Okay? So if I plane a surface with a blade that was sharpened to, let's say, 1,000 grit, and one that was sharpened to 800 grit, after it's finished, my customer would not know the difference. I do, but they would not. So at what point is sharp enough? As long as you get a clean cut, and as long as you can work effectively without having to force your tool through the wood, and you get a decent finish without tear out, then you are sharp enough. How sharp is that? To some extent, you'd need to figure that out for yourself, and it's also dependent on which woods you work on. Okay? Australian blackwood planes beautifully to a sheen, but it is incredibly brittle and it tears out. So your blade needs to be a little bit sharper, and you need to be more cognizant of the grain direction that you're planing in. So those are considerations you need to take in consideration. If you're working in pine, a lot of people pull up their noses and don't want to work in pine. Sometimes working in pine is really nice, and you can make really nice stuff from pine. And if you look at something like Douglas fir, which we often call Oregon pine, is not a pine. Okay? So, but your blades need to be sharper because the wood is a little bit softer. If you work in Kiat, many of you guys online wouldn't know what Kiat is, but if you work in Kiat, which is Southern African hardwood, Kiat tends to be a little bit on the soft side. Okay, it dings easily, but it planes beautifully, but you need to have a sharper blade. So the softer your wood is, the sharper your blade needs to be, and then your blade geometry comes into play as well. So that's another thing we need to take in consideration. So I am going down that rabbit hole, so let me pull back a little bit. So that's the definition of sharp. Any questions on sharp and sharp enough? So what I do is I have, if you go on the easy lap stones from fine, which is this one here, and you go to a strop, that is sharp enough. And I'll tell you more about this kit a little bit later, because the stone is nowhere near as fine as the easy lap's finer stones, and then it goes from there to a strop. And I've committed, while testing it, to commit using only that in my workshop. Okay, two stones. So it's got a rough side, coarse side, and a fine side. So one double-sided stone and a strop. And I've effectively worked without any issues for just over a year. Yeah.
Can I just summarize, I think, what you said? The softer the wood, the sharper your blade must be.
Yeah. If you ever want to know if your blade is sharp enough, so let's say you're teaching yourself how to sharpen a blade by hand. It is a muscle exercise that you need to develop over time. So you'll see when I do a demo and I do it freehand. It's just the muscle memory that I've developed. But if you're developing that process and you want to check that you are able to sharpen a blade to a level that is acceptable, always test it on a soft wood. Because a soft wood is much less forgiving for a blunt blade. So if you want to know if it's sharp, always test it on a softer wood. That will quickly tell you where you are. Does that answer your question? Answer your question?
Yes, no, that's fine.
Okay. Great. Jordan, any questions online yet? Good mornings. How many people do we have online?
9 viewers right now.
So 9 viewers. You guys should have been here. It's a full class. Maybe Jordan should swing the camera around. That's, of course, going to screw up our framing. There we go. Guys, wave at the camera. Come on.
Wave. Mornings all around.
Yeah, the top of my head is in focus. Correct. Okay. So let's continue. I use this as much as a guide as you guys. So what is sharp enough? So we've done that. Now we look at blade preparation, and this is the most critical part of getting a sharp blade, even to some extent more than sharpening the blade from a routine perspective on a daily basis. This is really, really important. Okay. Now there are some, shall we say, shortcuts that you can take, and I'll tell you about them. But blade preparation is really, really important. Now, if I'm sharpening a plain iron like this one here, it's got the primary bevel, it may have a secondary bevel, and we'll discuss that, and we've got the back of your plain blade. Now, every time you sharpen, you're not going to do the back of your plain blade. You're only going to do the primary and the secondary bevel. Never do, well, not never, but in a routine situation, you're not going to work on the back of the blade. It just takes too much time. And it's also not necessary because that's a fixed surface. But really, really important for the quality of your cutting edge and how acute you are able to get your cutting edge, you need to prepare your plain iron or a chisel or something like that. You need to prepare it before you sharpen it. And by preparation, I mean that you need to flatten the back. And anybody you see on the net and gives advice about sharpening or prepping a blade will tell you you need to flatten the back. And the reason you would need to do so is because it's a fixed surface and you're not going to be working on it every time you sharpen. So let's say that's the back of your blade. Which side? It's better this side. Okay, so let's say that's the back of your blade. You work on it once. You flatten it once. Okay? That is now your primary bevel. We're still going to talk about secondary bevels and where they come into play. So every time you sharpen your blade, you're working on this bevel here, and that gets smaller, or shall we say, closer and closer to the back of your blade. So next time you sharpen, that's where it is. Next time you sharpen, that's where it falls. That's a little bit over-exaggerated, but that's what happens. So in other words, that remains fixed, and as you sharpen your primary bevel or remove metal from your primary bevel, that edge where they connect moves into the preceding sections of the back of your hand plane. Okay? So now you can imagine that your preparation at the bottom here is relatively crucial. And that is to allow you to get an acute as cutting angle as you possibly can. Make sense? Happy, everybody? Okay. So that is the process. So we need to flatten the bottom of a hand plane or a chisel, whatever it may be. The good news is you only need to do it once. I take a week or so and I go and I maintain all my hand planes in a year. Okay, my collection is growing, just like woodworking squares, of which one cannot have enough. I cannot have enough hand planes. I think I'm now in excess of 15 or something like that. And the worst is, I've taught myself how to make them. And usually the limiting factor of what planes you can make is the blades that are available. And I have now taught myself how to make my own blades. So now the sky's the limit. Okay, so last year I went into a plane making spree. So I made the jointer and I made 2 compass planes. Compass plane is the sole is rounded along its length and across its width. And you use them to hollow out chair seats and so forth, so you can get them and dig them out the seats, the saddle on the seats. So I have the planes. So now I need to build the chairs. But as long as you can make a blade and then you can make a hand plane, and as long as your bedding angle is 45 degrees, they're really easy to make. The moment you start looking at the low angle stuff, it becomes complicated. So I've got a fast growing selection of hand planes. So once a year I will go, I have a look at my blades, have a look at the back, make sure I flatten them again, but I'll do it on a smooth stone so that if it's flat and I go to a coarse stone, that I don't rough up the back of the iron. I'll tell you why that's important in a second. I reset my bevels and I do my chip breaks and I do all the setups and I oil everything and maintain my hand planes. Question? Okay, so I do that once a year. So even though that I say you only need to flatten the back of a hand plane blade or a chisel once a year, once off, I tend to do maintenance just to make sure that they are flat. I'm a little bit pedantic that way. Now, first of all, it needs to be flat. For that to happen, your stones need to be flat because that now is your reference surface. So you need to use a flat stone to flatten any hand plane blade or chisel. Here's a caveat, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But you want it flat. Often, many will say that it needs to be flat. And then you put out about 7 hours on your Saturday, and you work on one blade, and you get it flat. It only needs to be flat 4 millimeters, 3 millimeters, 5 millimeters back from the cutting edge. It does not need to be flat all the way. Now that's not so much an issue with a plain blade. However, often many are taught to take a chisel and get it flat all the way back. And the cheaper your chisel is, the harder it's going to be to do that. It's not necessary. Chisels is a little bit different in that I try to get them flat, say about 20 mils, 25 mils, an inch roundabout back. And the reason for that is the back of my chisel is my reference surface. So if I place my chisel and I'm cleaning up a shoulder of a joint or something like that, the back of my chisel is my reference surface. So only having a millimeter or 2 millimeter back from my cutting edge as my reference surface makes for a less accurate tool. So there I'll spend a little bit more time. But they never, well, not never, more often than not in a routine workshop, they're never as wide as this so you don't spend as much time removing material. Something I neglected to mention when I said sharp enough. It's incredibly important to note that a dull tool is a dangerous tool. The duller your tool is, the harder it is to push through a cut. The less accurate it becomes, the more force you need. And believe me, when I say dull, it doesn't mean dull. It means that it can still draw blood and sever tendons and do all kinds of unpleasant things to you. Okay? When I say dull, I'm saying not a clean cut, but it's still sharp enough to spoil your day. Okay. When I taught myself to sharpen, our kitchen is here, the workshop's here, the guest bathroom is there. If I'm moving at pace past the kitchen and my wife is there and I say, bring the plasters, she knows. Okay? I can't do anything for myself because I'm trying to stem the bleeding. I was weighing up if I should bring a scraper to show you how to sharpen a scraper. It's different than a blade, but the worst cuts I've ever had in my workshop, almost down to the bone on my thumb, was a scraper. Believe it or not. That little thin hair burr, that thing's sharp. It's really, really sharp. And the worst cuts I ever got was a scraper. But she knew the drill. Bring the plasters. And we're both in the medical business. That's where I started. That's where she still is. She still cannot look at blood. So, there you go. Anyway, so that's the process of sharpening. Now, this will come into play in efficiency as well. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But that's the preparation of the back of your blade. Now, this is a little bit contentious. So often the guys will show you, one thing that's important is, let's say you've decided on a system, 3 stones and a strop. The back of your blade at least should be flattened and polished to the same level as which you are, or grit, as which you are going to be sharpening when you use your tool in use. And the reason why that is the case, so you need a coarse stone to start flattening the back. Believe me, you need a coarse stone. If you do not have a coarse stone, you can use what they call the scary sharp method. You put sanding paper on a piece of flat glass, and there you can go very high in the grits. It's very coarse. But remember, when you make striations or a scratch pattern in the back of your plain blade, and you go up the higher grits, you're going to need to get rid of those striations. So the deeper you start, the harder you're going to need to work to get it polished. Keep that in mind. Okay? But you can if you don't have a very coarse stone. So I've actually got a very coarse stone that is dedicated only to flattening the backs of my tools. That's all it does. It doesn't do anything else. So you go through the different grits. So you start coarse, you go medium, you go fine, and then you go to a strop. And you'll see when I do a demonstration, I always polish the back on the strop. Even though I'm not flattening it, every time I sharpen, I polish the back because that just makes sure that it's polished to a finer and finer and finer degree so that I have to worry less about the acuteness. Question?
When you talk about coarse, are you like 60, 80, 120? What sort of?
As far as sanding paper goes, let's start at 120. 120, 180. So it's one of those things that's sort of determined by a lot of things in regards to not only how coarse it is, but what the metal alloy is of your blade as well. Some metal blades are, in the tempering process, are more pliable, so it's easier to remove metal. So your scratch pattern is going to be deeper, or harder metals you may need to have a coarser to get to where you need to be. So it's a little bit of a thumb suck. But that is an option. If I had the option, I would go for a coarse diamond stone, or even a coarse Japanese stone. Japanese stones cut very efficiently. So even if you just use a Japanese stone for the rough work, that may be an option as well and cost effective. Problem with the Japanese stone, it needs to be flattened. That's one of the issues. Where was I? So you need to go through the grits and it needs to be honed or polished to the same level as which you will be sharpening. And the reason for that is, so if I'm flattening the back of, let's say, my hand plane, I tend to pull horizontally across the width of the plane. So I'm going to make scratches in the back of my hand plane because I'm removing material and because I'm not using a fine grit, it's not getting a polish. I want this to happen. But now I have to go through the grits to get that scratch pattern to go finer, finer and finer and finer and work through that process. Now I want to have it at the end as polished as I can, because if I look at the top, so this is the back of the hand plane, bevel is on the other side. If I've got striations going into my cutting edge as a result of the coarseness of the stones I've been using, I start getting this. It could be at a micro level, but that's what happens. So now I'm going from a nice sharp chef's knife to your mother's bread knife. Because of that striations, I now have little gaps in my cutting edge. And often if you take your hand plane and you want to, and hand planes do get dings and you push it into a nail or something like that and it gets a ding. If you take your blade like this, and I'll send this around, if you take your blade like this and you pull your thumb along the cutting edge, you'll feel where it's coarse and you'll feel where there's gaps. And this one actually has gaps. It shouldn't, but it does. Be sure you're not fooled by dust, by the way. So you'll feel for sharp that way, or feel that you have gaps. And often that will be the case. Now, that scratch pattern can go to a micro level to the point where you won't feel it. But the less straight your cutting edge is across, the less clean the cut will be. So let's say you're doing finishing cuts, like I do. I don't sand, and I'm planing my workpiece. The less clean that is, the worse the surface becomes. To the point where if I've got big gaps in there, if you feel on the wood, you'll actually feel the striations on the wood. So that's why we polish it at least to the point or to the grit that you'll be using when sharpening your blade. That's ideal. That's what I'd like to suggest you do. If you look at some of my blades, you'll see they're not incredibly shiny because I get bored at doing it. I've become good at flattening a back by looking out of my window and seeing what my neighbors do on their driveway. Okay, it's a laborious, boring task that's a little bit mind-numbing. And honestly, for some planes that I use for coarse work, that I don't use for finishing and so forth, I don't polish it to that level. Now, everything I've been telling you to this point can, to some extent, at least for plain blades, be chucked out of the window. Because what you can do, which will save you a lot of time, is a technique called the Charlesworth method or the ruler trick. So remember, I've had my plain blade on the surface flat like so, and I'm working away all of that metal. So what the ruler trick is you get a thin metal ruler, you put it on this side of your stone, and you rest your blade on top of it. And what that does is it pops your blade up, so when you are flattening it, you are only removing that small area of metal. So what's happening is this. Now, I can't remember his first name, but his surname is Charlesworth. He developed it, and Rob Cosman is a big promoter of that method. I do all my plain blades and chisels. Ruler trick is a little bit tricky for chisels, and I'll tell you why. But I flatten all of them, and I'll explain to you why I do that now. So let's say this is the surface of your stone. That is your ruler, and then you've got your plain blade or whatever you're sharpening sitting on there. So instead of flattening that area and removing all of that material, you're only focusing on the first 2 to 5 millimeters right behind your blade, and you're only removing the material there. And as you go through the grit, you take your ruler along, and this simplifies or has the potential to simplify your life quite significantly. Okay, so that's one of the methods you can use, and that makes your life a little bit easier. My problem with this is that if I'm looking at my plain blade, that's the bottom, that's my that's my bevel. It hollows that out. Now it's slight. It's really, really slight. It won't affect the operation of your plain blade at all. Note I say plain blade. I'm not saying anything about chisels yet. That hollows it out. And I'd prefer to have everything flat up to the cutting edge. So that's just my preferred way of doing it. But using the Charlesworth method very definitely is an option for you. Should I ever choose to flatten my back of my plain blade, I now need to remove all of this material until I take the back flat there. So if I should ever choose to flatten the back of my tool, I've now given myself a significant amount of work. And if you should ever re-establish or redo the back of your chisel, or not chisel, hand plane, you need to use, to get there quickly, you need to use the same ruler on the same stone. So there's certain criteria you need to match to consistently do this. The argument is you only need to do this once, so you never need to again. But I like to maintain my blades. Metal moves. Something is flat today may not be flat in a year's time. I've found that constantly, especially if you buy tools on a budget. The cheaper the tools become, the more the metal in the blade tends to warp. And it's not just for modern tools as well. Remember the alloys of blades and so forth that was used in Bailey pattern planes 100, 150 years ago may not be as stable in use, so you may need to flatten them more often. But as a thumb suck, you flatten once and never again. That is the theory. Practice is a little bit different. Okay, especially if you're on a budget. Any questions on flattening the back?
How far from the jig is the tip from the blade base? Because that affects the angle of your.
Yeah, so it's really a case of how wide your sharpening stone is.
I try and keep it as far back as my stone will allow.
As far back as you can, yes. Yeah, but then if you have it hanging off the side to give it a little bit more space, you need 15 hands. Or you need your wife to hold the ruler while you stand and sharpen. It's happened. Question in the back first.
Yeah, how long are you taking to do this? Is it like 5 minutes with the stone, or is it half hour? Obviously it depends on how cracked the back is.
Crap the back is and the quality of your blade.
But what are you talking about? Half hour or 5 minutes?
Let's put it this way. Naric's Richter chisels are really good chisels. Okay, so if you're going to be spending money on chisels, buy those. They take 5 minutes. Our friend Stanley from Ardendorf's or Chamberlain's, an hour. So it depends. And the narrower your chisel is, the less metal you have to remove. If you get those nice lacquer thumb inch wide chisels, it's going to take you longer. So it varies. So yeah, when I make my own blades, the thinner the blade gets, because of the heat treatment, it buckles and warps. So the thinner the blade is also takes more time than the thicker blades that stay more stable after the heat treatment. So it varies quite significantly.
What do you reference against to say it's flat?
The stone. So let me show you. So, and this actually comes back to the argument. So there's two things in my head that I need to still get back to. I hope I remember. Question?
As far as chisel planing sharpening is concerned, are there different rules for bevel up and bevel down?
Not when you sharpen it, but it does affect the geometry of your blade. I'll explain to you. Remind me. If I don't get back to it, just remind me, please. And I'd forgotten the two things I needed to cover. So the reason you don't use the ruler trick on chisels, remember I said, that's your reference surface. The moment you start hollowing that out, you lose your reference surface. And to keep that front area down, rather than learning the muscle memory of keeping your chisel flat, now I need to pop my chisel up a little bit to reference that surface. Okay? So keep that in mind. However, our friends at Stumpy Nubs, if you see them on YouTube, I don't watch them anymore, but Stumpy Nubs actually went and tested the ruler trick on chisels to see if it affected, because that's always been the argument. Why can't I use the ruler trick on chisels? It's because you lose that reference surface. And they've actually done it and found that it didn't affect the operation of your chisel that much. But it does need you to change your body geometry a little bit. Now, flattening using the ruler trick, depending on your ruler, stone, and so forth, may change the geometry. So every time you need to learn sort of a different muscle memory, whereas if it's flat, you learn that you need to keep the chisel flat in the situation. So I feel that it's just easier for the quality of your work down the line. Coming back to how flat is flat. So your stone determines how flat it's going to be, so therefore invest in a quality stone. Easy lap, good quality. DMT, good quality. I had a student with me 2 weeks ago, and he had these very thin diamond plates that he got really, really cheap from China. And what he did to them is he stuck them to plywood. So the plywood keeps it perfectly flat, and he stuck it to plywood so there's no flex. And that worked really, really, really well. Really well. So that's a cost-effective option. Apparently, Paul Sellers had a video around that. And because it's cheap and Chinese, it's not going to keep its abrasiveness as long as a quality stone would, but it's a cheap option to get into diamond stones. Only problem is we were working with it very nicely. We use a lubricant to get rid of the swarf. Lubricant gets in between the plywood and the thin plate. It delaminates it, and while he was sharpening his blades, I was repairing his diamond stones. So, okay, no perfect solution in woodworking, in life for that matter. So how flat is flat, and how do you know if it's flat? So what you will typically see on a lot of hand planes, if you're lucky, even on the cheap ones, actually you don't want a hand plane to be perfectly flat. And they aim for it, and for instance, my low angle jack, my Veritas PMV 11 blade, I love that thing. Okay, it almost makes me feel guilty because the metal is so good, I hardly ever need to sharpen it. It's just weird. The guys really do a good job there. But what you want effectively, and I'll send this one around so you can see it, you want it to be flat. Often the blades are flat like this. Okay, so you have a hollow here from which no metal gets removed, but you remove metal here. Now you don't have a lot of metal to remove, and you get to flat quicker. It's also easier to maintain down the line. So this is ideal. Often you'll have it with a little bit of a hollow in the middle. If you are unlucky, you get it with a boop bench here. So if you look at it from the side, if that's the back of your blade, it's high. And you have to get rid of the high point before you start removing the metal up to the cutting edge. Now, Paul Sellers had a really nice video where he took a plain blade, Stanley, and it had this. And he took a rubber mallet. You know, he uses those Thor hammers. He doesn't use a traditional hammer. It's got the rubber head. And he whacked it. It really nailed it. And it actually bumped it back into the opposing direction, just popping the metal back. And then I got myself a cheaper hand plane. I don't think it was the Showbiz. It was something else. And lo and behold, it had this. But the modern planes, it's not the same metal. It's not as pliable, and they're thicker. And I thought, bargain, I can test it. And on the third whack, I cracked it, top to bottom. Because it was a more brittle metal. And it was thicker. So guess what? I had to replace the blade. So some things work for some people. And what do they say? Your mileage may differ. Or mileage may vary. That's what they usually say. So flatters, you need to be flat. You need to have the scratch pattern of the grits that you are working on all the way to the cutting edge. What you may sometimes see at the very, very, very cutting edge, and I see that often. So if that is the back of the plane, that's the top. So as your bevel comes down, what often I see is it just dips there. We're talking 1/2 mil. Now, if I'm removing metal here until such point as it is flat up to there, you need to keep going. And that's what's going to take you 2 hours to do. Okay? What I have found, ladies, it may not be so much in your case, but what I have found is if I am flattening a chisel and I have it, or plain blade, and I have it flat, you need to spread the pressure of your fingers across the whole blade. Okay? And you don't need a lot of pressure on diamond stones, by the way, and I'll show you how much pressure you need. They say it's about enough pressure that you need to push down on a grape to start deforming it. I don't know what grapes they use in California, but South African grapes seem to be a little bit more robust. So they're not as easy to put pressure down. You don't need a lot of pressure. But what I tend to do is I will often focus a lot of pressure in the middle, inadvertently, not on purpose or anything. And I put so much pressure down on the middle of the blade that I flex it. That I actually push the blade in, that I remove more material here than I do on the rest of the blade. And that's on a flat surface. Okay? So it can be done. One needs to be careful. You have to put your pressure over the full blade itself. You can flex it. You can even flex a metal-bodied hand plane. Grip the front, grip the back, you can actually bend it like a banana. Okay? Paul Sellers actually does that on purpose to get rid of tear out. It's an old technique he uses to get rid of tear out. So he actually flexes a plain blade and then he planes for tear out. It increases the angle of the cut. So it is possible. So if we have enough time, you guys have Japanese chisels, eh? Yes. Okay. If you have enough time, go and have a look at the Japanese chisels. That's exactly the premise that they work on. They are hollowed here on purpose for exactly that reason, so that you don't need to remove a lot of material when you use them. Okay? Problem is, as you sharpen them, and I don't believe that hobbyists, even professional woodworkers these days, will sharpen a blade often enough to bring your cutting edge into the hollow, because that can happen. And what they then do is they sit with a little hammer and they bang the back to pop that out this direction so that you re-establish that surface. Okay. But have a look at the Chinese chisels. They work exactly that way. And that's the reason why. So if you're lucky, you get this. If you're unlucky, you'll be spending some time at the stones, unfortunately. And don't use the hammer unless it's a thin Stanley blade, because you are prone to crack your blade. Okay. Any questions? I covered the one thing that I thought I needed to remember, but not the second. Maybe I'll remember later. Jordan, everything good online? Yeah. Cool. Can everybody hear me online? Cool. I need my eyes. This is becoming much worse, and my wife and myself have come to the point we can actually share glasses. They say it's a sign of how old you are. Let's have a quick look around blade geometry. So now we're talking about the angles at which you need to form the bevel of your planes, chisels, why you might want to vary it, and then where bevel up hand planes come into the argument. So I'm going to send this around. This is sharp. If you want to check how sharp it is, feel perpendicularly to the cutting edge. Okay? Have you guys got plasters? Okay? Do not wipe your finger along the cutting edge. Okay? It will cut you. This hasn't been sharpened recently, but it's blunt. It doesn't shave. But once again, it will draw blood. Okay? There are various ways to check if it's sharp enough. It varies from shaving your arms. I sometimes have a serious lack of hair on my forearm because I like playing and seeing how sharp I can get it, so how easily it's shaved. The other option is to, on your fingernail, just let it see if it grabs your fingernail. If it does, it's usually considered to be sharp enough. This is not sharp, but it does grab my fingernail. So in some quarters, this would be considered sharp enough. In my case, I don't. Looking at the blade geometry, you'll see a couple of things. Just want to show you. Take that away. Okay. You'll see I've colored it with a marker, and I'll explain to you why I do that in a second. So blade, top of the blade, back of the blade's been flattened. You can have a look at it, see to what level I've actually buffed and honed it or polished it. Then the top, you'll see there's a primary bevel. That is the blue one. At the very edge, you'll see there's another bevel. That is the secondary bevel. And I'll tell you why I use both. I'm going to send this around. Do be careful. So if you want to feel the edge, you can feel perpendicularly across. If you look at the edge, the very edge, you'll see it's a black line. How's it? You'll see it's a black line. Okay? You want a black line because that means there are no surfaces that reflect light. And if there are no surfaces that reflect light, your two planes have come together in an acute matter to the point where it does not reflect any light. So some guys will just check the edge and see that there's no light and decide that that is sharp enough. Once again, for me, I don't consider that to be sharp enough. Okay, primary bevel, 25 degrees or thereabouts. So if you look at your plane blade or chisel, that angle there is 25 degrees. That is the generally accepted angle that a primary bevel should be shaped at. You'll note that I say not sharpened at, but shaped at. Okay. A bit of a, what do you call it? A revision on that. I'm reading more and more, and one of the proponents there is Chris Swartz. Chris Swartz has a company called Lost Art Press. He specializes in making traditional chairs. Love the guy, absolutely love the guy. But he will often go to 30 degrees as well. Okay? So anywhere between 25 and 30 degrees is good. And honestly, anywhere between will work. Okay, I'm having trouble writing like this. Can you guys read this? Okay, so anywhere between 23 and 33, but aim here. I always aim for 25 degrees. Okay, now guys, ballpark. So I know a lot of people will measure it, check it, redo it, go back to the stones. use jigs, use all kinds of stuff to constantly hit 25. But honestly, 26 degrees, 27 degrees, 28 degrees, 24 degrees does not matter. Honestly, it does not. Because, and often, some will sharpen their blade to that primary bevel. Okay? And if you use a lot of jigs, or if you use jigs to sharpen your blades, that is probably what you'll end up doing. So you sharpen your cutting edge to that 25 degrees. Question? No. Okay. So often the guys will sharpen to 25 degrees. And there's a couple of issues with this. Okay? Doing that. And I'll explain to you why. Now, learning to sharpen with a jig, be it the Veritas jig or being what we call the clip style jigs, is a good place to start. There is no shame in sharpening with a jig. If only it teaches you what the sharp blade should feel like. Okay? So if you don't know what sharp is yet, if you haven't figured out what sharp is for the tools that you have in your workshop, and you want to do hand sharpening, use a jig. That will get you to sharp. That will tell you what sharp feels like, both when you feel the blade, test the blade, and in use. Guys, if I'm using my hand planes, by sound alone, I can tell you when they're blunt. I know what my tools sound like. Tricky thing is, that doesn't sound like this, doesn't sound like this, doesn't sound like my metal hand planes. But you can hear a blunt blade. And the difference between a clean cut and a blunt cut. I make my own. The gentleman that I mentioned that was at class with me earlier, we made one of these. Okay? I'm both proud to say and a little peeved to say that the hand plane that he made is single-handedly the best hand plane that has ever come out of my workshop. To the point where I am jealous. I wanted to give him this one and keep his. It was a brilliant, well, it is a brilliant tool, but absolutely amazing. And we made the blade and everything. But you can hear it. You can hear a blunt blade. Okay? I've once had a request from a colleague within the woodworking community. Can I sharpen and set up his hand plane? And I said, by all means. How are you going to sharpen it when I give it to you? Because he didn't have the necessary tools. He says, no, I'll just bring it back to you. What do you mean you'll bring it back to me? No, I'll use it for about a month and then I'll bring it back to you. So I sharpen, depending on what I'm doing, I'm sharpening if I'm finishing, 5 to 10 minutes. Okay? That's how often you need to sharpen to be able to use an effective tool. So sharpening a tool and leaving it and using it for a month, not going to cut it. And it affects your safety and the quality of your work. Okay, so do keep that in mind. Another rabbit hole. So that's between 25 and 30 degrees. How do I figure that out? Two ways. This is probably the most used tool in my workshop. So if you don't have one of these, if you're sharpening your own hand planes, get one of these before you leave. Really, if I can suggest that, do. So typically how I would check it is I would pop my blade, the back of my blade, onto that reference. I bring up the protractor, okay, and I pop that in and I see if I can see light coming through between the bottom of that surface and the top of my blade. That tells me what the angle is of my primary bevel. Okay? My secondary bevel is going to be so small, and I'll tell you why I use a secondary bevel in a minute. My secondary bevel is going to be so small that it's really hard to check. So my secondary bevel is very much a guesstimate as long as it's steeper than 25 degrees. But I'll tell you about that now. So I'll typically do that. I'll bring that one across, and that is exactly 24 degrees. Okay?
This blade of yours here looks like it's hollow ground.
It is hollow ground, yes.
And I think there's a big discussion topic around that.
There could be. So, yeah, it could be. So we'll talk about grinds in the next one. So that's how I check my 25. And I only ever really use this tool, although I use it a lot. I use it on my turning tools a lot. I do happen to turn occasionally. I use it on my turning tools a lot because on turning tools, you are constantly adjusting your bevels. Effectively, you should be doing the same with your other tools as well. And I'll tell you the reasons for that in a second. But I use it for my turning tools, and I really only use it when I re-establish my primary bevel. I do that every so often because my secondary bevel gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and as a result, I often will reset my primary bevel, and then I use that to check how accurately I'm working. Or I get lazy. And what I do is I just color the bevel with a permanent marker. I go to my bench grinder. I tap with a hammer. I tap my platform one way. I start up my grinder, or I even turn it by hand, and I see where the scratch pattern sits in relation to what I've marked. So I've colored it in, and now I'm removing metal, and I know where I'm removing metal. Okay? And then I just go up and down with the platform until my grinder hits the middle of my bevel. And then I reset my bevel. If I'm afraid, and remember, I'm now eyeballing it. Okay? So Mark II eyeball that needs some help. So I'm doing that every time just by eyeballing, and sometimes I will go too much in the one direction or too much in the other direction. And if I just want to check that I'm general, between 25 and 30 degrees, I'll just check with the protractor and see where I am. Make sense? Okay. So that is the primary bevel. Now we talk about secondary bevels. Okay? And to really confuse you guys, I might even talk about back bevels. Yours works better than mine. I don't know what happened there. We might need this. Well, what do you know? Not just good for removing swarf. Secondary bevel. So, you okay with me sketching this way up? Okay. So it's difficult for me to go horizontal, but I don't want to stand with my back to the camera. Now, top of the plane. Now this is chisel, plane blades, whatever. Okay. Top. That's the back. Remember, you flattened it. Primary bevel. Anywhere between 25 and 30 degrees. Okay? Secondary bevel. So now we have an additional bevel to the whole setup that serves to confuse everybody in the room. Okay? Secondary bevel. Now, really, I have no means of measuring it. So really is thumbsuck or ballpark. But let's say that is 25 degrees. That will be steeper than 25 degrees. They say up to 35. Okay. So the secondary bevel is steeper than your primary bevel. So your primary bevel is not what makes the cut. It's this area here. Okay? And that is 35 degrees. Just to throw a spanner in the works, that is not the cutting angle of a standard hand plane. Coming back to your low angle question. 35 degrees is not the cutting angle of a bevel down hand plane. Explain to you why. If I have a secondary bevel on my chisel and I'm using it in this manner, not upside down. There are reasons to use a chisel upside down. But if I use it like this to push across the grain, they usually call it slicing or paring. When I'm slicing or paring, my cutting angle is 35 degrees. Okay, because that is how I'm pushing it into the wood. Not the case with a bevel down hand plane. I'll elaborate in a second. So, in the case of a bevel up hand plane, where if this is your bedding, or this is the bed that your plane blade is sitting on, okay, so let's say, I think it's 12 degrees, I'm not sure, but let's say that is 12 degrees bedding angle, okay, so that is a frog, that's what your plane sits on. On the bevel up, I don't know if it's called a frog, but it's your bedding angle. So let's say that's 12 degrees. See, now I'm getting myself into maths. And your cutting angle, you can have a secondary bevel there as well. But let's say the cutting angle there is 25 degrees. Upside down is not going to work. Okay? Your cutting angle in the case of a bevel up plane is 25 plus 12. So that is 37. Okay? So that is your cutting angle is 37. Very close to this. But in a bevel down plane, that is not your cutting angle. Your cutting angle on a bevel down plane is always, unless you change the frog or change the bedding angle, as I've done with this hand plane, your cutting angle will always be 45 degrees. Okay? So that is not your cutting angle. In the case of a chisel, it is. In the case of a bevel down hand plane, your cutting angle is 45 degrees. And the reason for that being is so that's your frog. That's 45 degrees. I'm still writing upside down. 45 degrees. Now, your plane blade, that's the top surface. That's your primary bevel. That's the back. So it doesn't matter what this is. Your cutting angle is always going to be this. Okay? Or 45 degrees is actually the angle there. And that is how a bevel down plane works. Your cutting angle is always going to be 45 degrees. Unless you add a back bevel. And that's what the article I'm launching next week is all about. Is this. Okay, high angle cuts for tear out. It's all about this. Is this clear, guys? Okay. Then, why does that even matter? To some extent, it doesn't. 25 degrees, between 25 and 30 degrees. Over many years of people using hand planes and tools and chisels and so forth, we have found that 25 degrees here, between 25 and 30 degrees, is the most optimal for general use for this bevel to be. Okay? What do we mean by optimal? With the metals and alloys that are available and tempering processes and the kinds of wood and everything else that we work on, we found that 25 degrees is a nice middle way where it clears the chips, it stays relatively sharp, it's relatively easy to sharpen, and taking all of the imperfect factors that play into the whole thing about woodworking, anywhere between 25 and 30 degrees is a good middle way to go. We just figured it out. Okay, that's why. Your secondary bevel can go up to about 35. Again, you need to balance the quality of your blade, the alloy, against what you are using it on and what scenario you are using it in to get a blade or an angle that is efficient in what it does, removes material efficiently, removes material leaving a reasonably good surface until such time as you start getting pedantic about finishing with a hand plane, Okay? And the edge retention is such. Lodi, how are you doing? Well, thanks. Your edge retention is such that you can work a reasonable amount of time. Okay? With the metals that we use in our blades. So it's a golden middle way. Now, use 35 degrees on softwoods, not going to cut as cleanly. Remember, wood is a bunch of straws. If you hold straws in your hand like this, with them pointing up, that's the wood fiber. Okay, bunch of straws. That's how it gets water in and out from the roots up to the rest of the tree. Often, when you are planing, you are cutting across those fibers. Now remember, they're hollow in the middle. So you want to slice through them as effectively as you can. The softer the wood is, the more it's going to give until such time as you go through. The harder the wood is, the more they're upright, the stiffer they are, they won't give way before you push the blade through. Okay? So, softer wood, would you say that a lower angle cut or a higher angle of cut would be more effective? Higher angle, lower angle. Higher. Okay? When we say higher, okay, are we talking higher like so or higher like so? Second. So when we say higher, this one. When we say higher, this one. Okay? That's a higher angle. Okay? So that's a higher angle cut. Okay? This one should be a lower angle cut. Okay? That's more acute. Softwoods, you want this guy. Hardwoods, you want this guy. Why? Softer woods, when you have a more acute angle, okay, it slices better. It's more acute edge. Okay? But it deteriorates quickly. But you do get a cleaner cut. Harder woods, you want a higher angle because it pushes back against you the fibers. Because the fibers are coarser, this gives you a longer lasting cut, but it doesn't need to be as acute as that because it's easier to cut through. And that's why I'm saying, if you want to see how sharp your blade is, use soft wood. Because that's going to tell you much quicker than a harder wood. This is, if you use this on something like oak or a sort of semi-blunt blade on oak or something like that, it's a little bit misleading. It does mean, of course, that you can use a hand plane longer before sharpening it, but the soft wood is going to tell you more quickly than anything else where you are in regard of your sharpness. Now, you can start, even if your cutting angle in a hand plane is 45 degrees, always 45 degrees, you can now start playing around how clean your cut is, what wood you're using, and all of those you can start adjusting. Okay? Really handy if you've got 5 number 4s waiting on the bench for you to pick up and work. All you need to do is remember what angles you've sharpened each one of. Okay? I've only got 2 number 4s. One I'm using with a York pitch, the other one I'm using for smoothing. So therefore, I always average at around about 35 degrees. I've never found it necessary for me to adjust my angles according to the wood I'm working on. Okay? I've always found that there, primary bevel 25 degrees, anything roughly steeper than 25 degrees is good enough for me. There is one exception where I've changed this, and that is on my mortising chisels. That's the only place I've changed that. And that is also where, if you do a lot of mortises with hand chisels, okay, you're not fortunate enough to have a mortising machine, or you don't own a domino and you're chopping a lot of mortises by hand, it may be a good idea to have an extra set of chisels sharpened at a higher angle, because remember, a mortising chisel works hard. You are really hitting it and it goes in not very far off perpendicular, straight into the wood, and you're cutting more often than not, you're cutting right across the end grain. Okay, end grain is the hardest thing to cut. Okay? That and Rhodesian teak. Okay? I will not take a hand plane to Rhodesian teak. Don't ask me to make anything out of Rhodesian teak. I do not have the patience. Although the very first hand plane I made was Rhodesian teak, believe it or not. But I will really, don't ask me to make anything out of Rhodesian teak. And the reason why Rhodesian teak, for those who don't know, we now call it Zimbabwe teak, is what makes Rhodesian teak so hard is it absorbs a lot of minerals out of the soil. A lot of minerals. Those minerals go into the cells, they crystallize, and they become like grit. And that's why Rhodesian teak is known for blunting tools. Okay? Don't ask me to plane Rhodesian teak. I'll do rosewood at a push, but Rhodesian teak, you can forget about it. So those are the reasons you'd be adjusting your angles. Are we looking for time? You guys want to take a quick break? Is it possible? Quick break? I'd like to have a glass of water if possible. So, okay, guys, let's make it 5 minutes. My watch says it's 10:15, so let's get back at 20 past. Okay, where were we? Secondary bevels. So, as I mentioned, you can sharpen the primary bevel so that it meets your back bevel at 25 degrees, and that will cut. Guys, that will cut, no problems. Do keep in mind that I am a commercial woodworker. Okay? I would be doing woodwork much rather than removing metal. And because I get paid for my time, the less time I spend at sharpening something, the better. Mortising chisels. I got myself a set of mortising chisels from here, specifically to chop out the mortises for these. They need to be perfect, they're shoulderless, so you don't have a shoulder to hide all your gaps and stuff. It's a functional, if it's not perfect, it's still a functional joint. But you want to make it look nice. If you're going to be spending the amount of time making one of these, you might just as well get it to look nice. Also, the nicer these two surfaces glue to one another, the stronger this joint gets. Remember, if I'm using a hand plane and I'm pushing it forward, I'm getting resistance in this direction. I don't want to lever the handle out of the body. And that's why I got the mortising chisels. The Narix mortising chisels that you have there, came here, got my two chisels, went home, took my marking gauge. Now I'm just going to chop a mortise just to see if they are any better than my normal bench chisels. Paul Sellers is one. The English woodworker is another one. What's his name? Richard Maguire. Search the English woodworker. Guys, great sense of humor. A spade's a spade. And he's the first that will admit that none of his plane blades are particularly flat on the back. He always admits and says, I'm not a very good woodworker, but what I am good at is setting up my tools, and therefore that allows me to do accurate work. He's a great, I love his stuff. But anyway, he hasn't posted anything in a long time. So both of those guys prefer using bench chisels to chop mortises. And Paul Sellers has actually had a nice one where he chops a mortise with a piece of glass. So you can see how efficient he is in chopping the mortise, and he compares a mortising chisel against a bench chisel, and a bench chisel around about the same amount of time. There's just something therapeutic of having what they call a pick stick. That's what they call a mortising chisel out there, is to get it in your hand, get a nice big hammer, and just thrack it. Just give it gas. There's just something about it. So I got the two mortising chisels. The primary bevel is sharpened at 25 degrees. Got home, got a lacquer piece of oak, and start hitting the chisel. And 2 hits, blunt. Completely blunt. So much so that it doesn't matter how hard I hit it or how angry I was with my wife, I simply could not get it to penetrate into the wood. Took it out, had a look at the cutting edge, and it was trashed. It was completely deteriorated. Now, before he starts getting cold sweat, considering the fact that they sell the tool, I wasn't ready to bring it back yet. 25 degrees, I look at the cutting edge, and it literally, guys, literally, we're talking 1/2 mil deep. Look at the mortising chisel. Let's say that was where the start of your primary bevel, it looked like this. I got the frights of my life. Because I know Narix, I know how their metals, I know how well they treat their tools. And I had this and I was completely despondent. I took it out. I fixed this on the bench grinder. And I gave it a secondary bevel, steeper at 25 degrees. Nothing beats them. Absolutely nothing beats them. I changed nothing. The metal is still the same. The tool is still the same. Your primary bevel is still at 25 degrees. But that increased angle at the cutting edge, day and night. Not the same tool. It penetrates, it cleans, it does everything that you would expect from a mortising chisel. Brilliant. So in spite of the fact that unless there's something really weird going on the wood I'm planing, generally I'll go 25 degrees primary bevel, little steeper than that secondary bevel, and I'm done. Okay, and the only place where I purposefully adjusted the bevel of the cutting edge was on the mortising chisels. Only place. And that was the reason. So you guys can rest assured that Narix mortising chisels are worth the money. Okay, bit of a one-horse pony, chops mortises and does little else, but they work a treat. Now, I did mention, being in a commercial setting, I don't want to spend all day sharpening or removing metal to get a sharp edge. Top of the blade, primary bevel, secondary bevel, back of the blade. Now, I would much rather be removing this amount of material to get a sharp edge than this amount of material to get a sharp edge. It's much more efficient, much quicker, especially if I'm sharpening every 10 to 15 minutes time. And I'll demonstrate it for you a little bit later. So now I'm removing only this amount of material to get a sharp edge. The disadvantage is this. Every time I sharpen, my secondary bevel becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. Until such point as now it's no longer efficient to remove that because I have all of that left. And then I will go and I will reset my primary bevel to what it was. Make sense? And that's why I like to have a secondary bevel.
And does it increase your edge retention at all?
Slightly. Because you have a blunter cutting edge, it's more robust. Okay. Now there's a few ways of getting a secondary bevel. Now we get to hollow grind, flat grind, or convex. I had geography in school and I still get confused with concave and convex. The easiest way. So there's two main school of thoughts as far as hand sharpening goes, and then you get the middle one, which is the only way you'll be able to get it flat is if you use a jig. Only way to keep a flat bevel. Okay? There is a guy also on the internet. I spend a lot of time on YouTube. There's a guy called Wood by Right. He sort of figured out a way to keep a flat bevel. Just don't invite any strangers to come to your house when you sharpen stuff. And I'll show you how he manages to do that. It's a little bit weird. Two schools of thought. You have a hollow grind, or you have a convex bevel. Rob Cosman, big proponent there. The English woodworker, Paul Sellers, proponents there. Paul Sellers recently had a video where he did chisels where he doesn't even put a secondary bevel. And this is what allows him to do it. Okay? Only way to get this, bench grinder or some round tool. Bench grinder, Tormek, be it what it is. What's nice about that is when you do your secondary bevel, you're removing very little material. And as your secondary bevel grows, you don't get to a point where you need to start removing a lot of material. Okay? That's the one. I like this one very much. I use this. Convex bevel here is often a function of the movement when you sharpen. And if you watch Paul Sellers, you'll see that he does this. Okay? He lifts his elbow at the back of the stroke. So he does that, and that causes this to happen. Okay? problem that I have with that, it's really easy to teach yourself to sharpen by hand using that method, okay? Because there's a lot more room for your normal body mechanics to be able to sharpen your blade. Problem with that is, if I'd like to change my bevel angle of my cut, I need to remove all of this material before I can start working on that angle there. Okay, makes sense. Of course, you always have access, well, if you do have access, you can use a bench grinder to get rid of this. Okay, so often what some will do, and Paul Sellers himself does that, he actually demonstrated one day, he got this big grinding wheel that he worked with a foot, and he actually re-established. So he doesn't say that often, but he does re-establish his primary bevels, and then goes into that process. Because the wheel that he uses is so big, okay, the radius is such that that is not a very tight curve. So you can barely see it. It looks almost flat. Middle of the road is having a flat bevel. And the only way you can do that is by using a jig. Either this way here or that one. And I've actually modified, or I redid one of the blades last night so I can demonstrate how to use it with one of those jigs. Any one of my blades, if I put it into a jig like that and set it to 25 degrees, I'm going to have facets. Because I do it by hand, I don't have a flat 25 degrees bevel. So for demonstration purposes, if I do something like that, as the blade that I'm going to use for the demo, I reset it to 25 degrees so that when I put it into a jig like that, I get close to 25 degrees so I can show whoever attends the class what a secondary bevel and a primary bevel looks like and how you do it with a jig like that. That's the only reason. But that's the only way you can get a flat bevel, is with a jig. Or you can do what the Wood by Right does, and he locks his elbows into his body, and his sharpening movement is this. Okay? So whenever he sharpens, it looks a little bit weird. Okay? But it works. Now, how do you reset this? Okay? This is easy. You can use grinders. But if you don't want to hollow grind and this has to be flat, how do you reset this when your secondary bevel goes back and back and back and back and back and back? Okay, so remember your secondary bevel is going in that, wrong way. Secondary bevel goes back. So the best way to do this is, let's say every 4 or 5, 6 times, depending on the blade and how fine your stones are, every time you sharpen, let's say every 10th time, you do both the primary bevel before you do your secondary bevel. And in effect, what you're doing, running out of space. So in effect, what you're doing is primary bevel, secondary bevel, back. So as this becomes bigger, every 5 or 6 times, you redo the primary bevel, you move that in, which then makes this smaller again. So you don't have to do all of your primary bevel every time you reset it. But you need to be disciplined in remembering every so often in your jig, set it to 25 degrees before you do your secondary bevel. That just keeps it under control. Okay? Because if this moves all the way back and now you don't have a grinder and you're only going to do it by hand, you're going to be spending almost as much time resetting your primary bevel as you spent flattening the back. Go ahead. Clear? Questions? Anywhere? None? Okay. So this blade here that I sent around, you'll see it's got a very small secondary bevel. And that's all you need. Now I did mention that I sharpen almost all my blades by hand. The only blade that I, on purpose, put in a jig to sharpen it is when I do a back bevel. I've got a fixed back bevel on my one number 4 at 17 degrees. That gives me a cutting angle, 45 plus 17 gives me 62 degrees. I want to have that consistent. And the only reason then for me to use a jig is I use the Veritas. Now if you're going to be spending money on a jig, you don't have them in stock, do you? Yeah. If you can get your hands on one of these, go for it. And if you can get the full kit, you don't necessarily need the full kit, but if you don't have the full kit, you either can't do very narrow blades, or you need to get the height adjuster if you're doing mortising chisels. But this thing is accurate, it's reliable, and you'll see the little wheel on the Eclipse. It's difficult to tilt and not keep your blade flat. That's your reference surface. Okay, it's really useful. And if you get the full kit, it also has a cambered wheel, if you like using cambers on your plain blades. I don't use cambers, but some do. I don't like using, well, there's no reason why I don't use cambers. I just like a flat edge, and then I take away the corners of a plain blade. Show you how I do that. But this is a really good tool. And what's nice about this is you can set high angles, you can set standard angles, or you can set back bevels on this. And this is a really useful little tool. Okay. So if you're going to be paying money for a jig, this is the one to go for. Okay. An Eclipse jig is going to cause you just headaches. They don't keep the blades square, the modern ones. If you get an older one, go for it. But the modern ones, the cheaper ones, they're useful. You can use them and you can modify them to some extent. But I do find, you'll see this one I try to modify to the point where I can't use it for chisels. The Veritas one is very good. Veritas has one that looks like this. Is quite good. So they've got this, but they have the one that looks like the lead jig as well. And that's quite nice to use. So every so often, do your primary bevel if you want to keep it flat. Otherwise, I just go to my grinder and I grind the bevel. Okay? Careful on a grinder, depending on the quality of the steel you use, it is going to heat up. If it overheats, you're going to burn the edge. You burn the edge, you lose the temper. You need to remove that burnt edge. Otherwise, you've got a weaker area in your blade that's going to deteriorate quicker in use, and you're going to get gaps and wear and all kinds of weird stuff. So if you burn it, you have to grind the cutting edge back, past the burn, and redo it. These cheap Stanleys are really prone to burning. And now you want to remove the secondary bevel or the primary bevel until such time as you get as close as you can to the back. The less metal you have there, the less heat sink, the quicker they burn. Just a fact of metallurgy and so forth. So often when I reset the bevels, I actually don't reset all the way back to the back. I just reset them until my secondary bevel becomes acceptably small, and then I stop. Because the more metal I relieve here, the less likely I am to burn the edge.
Do you keep quenching your blade during?
Yeah. So what you do is you... So I'm laughing at myself. So you grind it until your fingers can no longer bear it because of the heat, and then you quench. Okay? And if you quench by that time, you've quenched too late. So quench sooner rather than later. So if you start feeling heat come off it, quench it. Okay? A warning, do not quench high-speed steel. Quench high-speed steel because of the way that high-speed steel is made, and you don't get plain blades really and chisels on high-speed steel, so that's for the turners. Don't quench high-speed steel because you will crack it. It can take a lot more heat, yes, but don't quench it because you can crack it. Okay, and burning it, you lose the temper. What else was I going to say about doing that? I'm fortunate, I actually bought myself a CBN wheel. So CBN is a carbon boron nitrate wheel. So it's similar, it works similar to a diamond wheel. And because it's the abrasive is attached to a metal wheel, the metal wheel acts as a heat sink, and therefore your tools don't heat up as quickly. I used these. One day I reset the bevels. I burnt every single one I own. I put them in a cupboard and forgot about them. Until I got the CBN wheel, I took these back out and reset the bevels. And the funny thing is I can actually get them sharper than I get my Narex chisels. And that's the nature of how soft the metal is, how much material you can remove to get the edge. So even though they get sharper than the Narex chisel, they don't maintain the edge as long. So there's always a very good reason to have more than one set of chisels. What can I say? Any questions?
Handmade jigs. I've seen Pinterest sweeting.
It's not worth the effort.
Not worth the effort.
No, not worth the effort. Maybe because I'm getting lazier, but I'm getting to the point in my woodworking where I am less prone to make my own jigs to do something than I am to buy it. One of the main considerations in making your own jigs is often it's not available. So in South Africa, there are simply just tools that you cannot get here. My YouTube, I've got a YouTube channel now. The episode that launched this morning is about making your own burnisher for sharpening scrapers. I think you guys have burnishers now, but for many years they had scrapers in the shop, but they didn't have burnishers. So there's no way for you to sharpen a scraper.
And that's the scrapers that you work with like this.
The thin plates, the card scrapers. So there weren't any burnishers available. So one of the options is you just use a screwdriver. A burnisher just needs to be harder than the metal you are forming. Okay, that's the only requirement. But it's nice to have a nice, shiny, you can see your face in it, burnisher. Also leaves a cleaner burr, by the way, so it leaves a cleaner surface. I made mine. So often you would need out of necessity to make your own, but sometimes it's not worth the effort. They don't last as long, they're often not as accurate. Now, I make chairs, so there are jigs that allow you to drill at specific angles and stuff like that. And that's really hard to do unless you've got 15 mirrors around you, okay? And you're checking the mirror for this angle, and you're checking that mirror for the other angle, because you want to get your tenons in a certain angle. So I made a jig to do it. So there's some value in doing it, but cheap as chips. And that's going to give you a level of consistency what a homemade jig may not very well do. Also, making a homemade sharpening jig is, remember, that's the surface you have to work on. Okay? The smaller the thing is that you need to make to be able to use with it, the harder it is to make accurately. So often you end up with something that is too big to effectively use on something like this. That's just my opinion. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, sharpening systems. So that's geometry, blade geometry. So that's really broadly what it all comes down to. So what blade geometry should you use? Anywhere between 25 and 30 degrees, secondary bevel. Higher than 25 degrees, around about 33. With the caveat, it depends. The metal that I use to make my own plain blade may not sharpen as easily, may not stay sharp as long. I might be using a hardwoods, I might be using softwoods. It depends. Honestly, it depends. So that's the beauty of the woodworking, is figuring it out. That's the frustration of woodworking, is figuring it out. And hopefully something like today, this morning, the time we're spending together, will answer some questions and send you in a direction where you need to make fewer mistakes yourself to ultimately get to a point where you have a tool that you can use. Okay. If there are no other questions, we'll go into sharpening systems. We're going quicker today than we did last time. Sharpening systems. So I'm working on an article for my website. I'm going to call it The Good, the Bad, and the Dirty. Let's start with the dirty. Oil stones, Japanese stones. Okay? Japanese woodworkers get a blade sharper than I believe anybody else in the world, by some margin. They have to, because a lot of the woods that they use are similar to cedar, softwood, so forth, so you need a very sharp tool to be able to effectively and cleanly work on those woods. So nobody gets tools sharper than they do, and they use Japanese stone. But if you watch any video where somebody uses Japanese stones, he takes his blade, he saunters off over a dedicated sharpening station, he's got running water, he's got his stones nicely mounted, and that's how he sharpens his stones, or sharpens his blades. Japanese stones go up to ridiculous grits. Okay? They go up to a point where if you take a blade off it, you can see yourself, your neighbor, and everybody else in the street in the reflection. Okay? It's that sharp and the grits are that high. To the point where, let me tell you why they work, or how Japanese stones work. Japanese stones have an abrasive, okay, that you need to have soaked in water. The water uses, not to get rid of the swarf, but what it does is the abrasive breaks off the surface and goes into a slurry. So apart from the stone surface itself that sharpens your stone, the slurry contributes. That's why Japanese stones are so quick, because it's not just this that sharpens your blade. It is both the stone itself and the slurry you generate. And that's why the stone needs to be wet, so that you can create the slurry. Some of their stones are so fine and it is so hard to break off to create the slurry that you need to use a different little stone to break up the surface so that you can make the slurry. Okay? I think they call it a Dharma stone or something like that. I've got one. So you rub your very high grain stones with the stone, that breaks off the particles, that becomes part of your slurry, and that then sharpens your blade. Okay? They are extremely dirty to use, and that's why they've got a dedicated station with running water. Okay? Both to keep the stones wet, but also it's a mess. And if you look at the videos from the guys who've been doing it a long time, you'll see these sharpening stalactites hanging from the bottom of the sharpening station. And that's where all that junk and gunk and whatever accumulates. So if you can accommodate a system that is dirty, that you're going to need to clean up after yourself, or you have a dedicated sharpening place to sharpen, Japanese stones are probably for you if you are cost conscious, because keep saying diamond stones. Japanese stones are relatively cost effective for what you get. You can go up to very high grades. Okay, look at Rob Cosman's sharpening station. It's tucked here under his workbench, and he uses those ceramic stones laminated or set onto a glass sheet that keeps it flat. It's dirty, really, really dirty. Okay, because the abrasive leaves the surface and then accumulates with the metal shavings, and it's just a filthy mess. The other disadvantage of Japanese stones is you hollow them out, and because you hollow them out, you need to flatten them. Often, to flatten them, you buy one of these. So if you're going to have one of them, you might just as well buy two more. Okay? So you use the diamond stone to flatten them. DMT has actually got a big one, coarse one, dedicated specifically for flattening stones, or sanding paper on a piece of glass. Keep the sanding paper wet and you flatten them. Okay? But if only flattening them was the biggest problem. I gouge mine with my blade. So when I sharpen and I use my blade on it and I do this and I pull back too far and I go forward, I gouge mine. I constantly gouge mine. Most of the wear in flattening down my Japanese stone has been to fix gouges. If you are going to be using something like this that keeps a consistent angle on the stone, by all means go for it. That's if you can stomach the amount of dirt that they produce. But I gouge mine. I'm constantly gouging mine. And if you're learning, I can guarantee you, you will gouge them. They're very soft because the abrasive needs to come off and make the slurry. So that's dirty. Oil stones, just as bad. They get really dirty. And if anybody can find a source of decent diamond stones in South Africa for me, please let me know. I'd love to try them. But we only get those crappy stones at the hardware places. And they're really bad. Okay? Don't even try using them. I've tried using them by saturating them in paraffin. I've tried them. The South African ones are crap. And unless you can get a flat one secondhand in South Africa, don't even try. They also hollow out. Okay? You may need to flatten them as well. Now, a stone that is flat across its width isn't as bad as a stone that is hollow along its length. So if you look at the stone, okay, upright, if it looks like this, if it dishes out, okay, it's not too much of a problem as long as along over its width, okay, it's flat, left to right. Because remember, if you're doing a convex shape, my art is deteriorating. So if that is convex, okay, that doesn't matter because you're pushing it and pulling it in the curve. Doesn't matter. However, if it does this, if you look at it end on and it does this, bad news. Can't use that stone. And often you'll see this kind of thing when people use it to sharpen a lot of gouges and stuff, because the gouges curvature causes that. Okay. You can flatten oil stones. I've never tried, but you can flatten oil stone with a coarser oil stone, and you can use a diamond stone, but honestly, I don't want to try it. Of course, your lubrication on those is oil or something like paraffin or something like that. Gets dirty. Also, really prone oil stones is they block up. So they block up with swarf, and they become really inefficient at removing metal, but the more they block out, the smoother they become, the keener the edge. So I also qualify that as the dirty. So,
Where do you put whetstone? Same as oil stone?
So whetstone is a bit of a catch-all term. Because you use a liquid to remove the swarf on these, they, in essence, or by the strict definition, qualify as a whetstone. So anything where you use a liquid to remove the swarf or to improve its working is in effect a whetstone. However, oil stones and water stones, because they are saturated in the liquid, they sort of lean more towards the strict definition of the name. Does that answer your question?
Well, yeah, I guess I'm referring to a water stone.
Say again?
I'm referring really to a water stone.
Yeah, they are called whetstones, but oil stones and these are also sometimes called whetstones because you use a liquid on them.
But a water stone, which says the same problems as an oil stone, or is it different?
It's better. Because it abrades and it removes the abrasive, your cutting surface is always new, whereas an oil stone blocks up. So I would place a Japanese stone above an oil stone by quite a margin. Although the English woodworker exclusively uses an oil stone. He shapes his bevel on a diamond stone because it takes away material quickly, but his final edge is on an oil stone. Look, and then you get the Arkansas stones and so forth that get finer and finer and finer, and you use water on them, get a finer edge. So there are other options. Okay, so what would you guys like to hear next? The good or the bad? Bad. Let's go with bad. Bad is scary sharp. Not because it doesn't get your blade sharp, because it's ridiculously expensive. And scary sharp is where you take an abrasive film. It's no longer just sanding paper. So you now get dedicated lapping films. 3M makes them. Guys, they go up to ridiculous grits. But that is a film or an abrasive film that you stick to a flat reference surface. More often than not, it's glass because it's readily available. They'll get your blade sharp. They'll get you into sharpening at a low entry cost. But when you start replacing sanding paper, your cost goes up one way, and that's up. They are horrendously expensive compared to other solutions. Now you may say, I can buy a lot of sanding paper for the price of this one, but believe me, the way that sanding paper tears, because you also want to use a wet sanding paper, you want to get rid of the swarf. So swarf is the metal shavings that come off your blades when you sharpen it. So you want to get rid of the swarf. The moment you wet that sheet, it tears. Yeah, never mind, I'll put another one on. It's a rand, 2 rand, whatever it costs. And remember, you need different grits as well. Your cost goes up exponentially. Okay? So this you buy, and most woodworkers will buy this once in their lifetime. And that is it. So scary sharp will get you sharp. From the name, it will also get you scary sharp. It will get you really, really sharp. But for the amount of effort, and you have to stick the sandpaper to the surface, then you have to use double-edged tape, and believe me, hardware store double-edged tape, not good enough. You need the good stuff. Good stuff stick. The more they stick, the harder they are to remove. Okay? So in the time you could have gotten your blade sharp, you've been sitting there, getting your fingernail between the glass and the double-edged tape, trying to get it off. It will get you to sharp, it will get you to very sharp, but it's not the most effective solution in the long run. So that's bad. Shall we go to good? These diamond stones. They're not cheap, okay? But they cut well. You get them in different grades, so you can go from aggressive to much finer. And if you go off the very finest stones that DMT has to offer, that's the one problem I have with Easy Lap. They don't have the range of grits that DMT necessarily has. Coming back, fine here is still good enough, especially if you go over to a strop. But DMT has got 2 other grits above this. So you can get off the stone directly. You don't need to go to a strop. So shop around, but these are really good quality. I've got 2 of them. So mine is a bit of a mix and match. I've got a mixture of different plates, and I've got a mixture of double-sided plates as well. So mine looks a little bit like, what's it, Frankenstein. Mine's all over the place because I've been collecting, and the reason I can talk about these sharpening systems, because I've tried to save money and I've tried all of them. And I've settled on diamond stones. They are consistently the best option. Okay? And at 15% off, a little bit of marketing, it's really worth the cost. Your entry cost is not cheap. Not cheap at all. And you can flatten the back of your chisels and hand planes using scary sharp. So you don't necessarily need to buy the coarser stone. Get the medium, get the fine. Okay? Or get the medium and get a coarser grit on your honing compound. It's possible. And that's what they did here on this system. This stone is surprisingly coarse. But when you go over to the leather strop, you've also got different coarseness in honing compounds. And the honing compound, this funky blue one, pity this thing doesn't keep looking like that because you take metal off and it turns black. But This is of the axe minister honing compounds, this is middle. So the gap between how coarse this is and how fine this is isn't all that much, so you don't need to spend much time. I need to mention, guys, that often you will have a fine, medium, coarse, and the question is, well, can't I just go from coarse to fine and only have the two stones? Remember the scratch pattern. And you need to remove the scratch pattern between different stones and go from finer, finer, finer. Otherwise, you simply have the serrations in your cutting edge. So you have to go finer over the grit. It's really important. Now, if I have a hand plane, primary bevel, and I'm using a coarse stone, I have to get rid of those striations. Now, I can do it going from a coarse to a fine stone. I'm just going to be spending much more time on the fine stone to get rid of it. So having a middle stone is more time efficient. And this is what they did here. They made a lot of compromises on this, and I'll tell you more about this. But that's why you have the middle stone, because you get to a point where you start removing the big scratch pattern, and we talk often about a scratch pattern. So the scratch pattern is the striations left by the abrasive that you've been using. So I get from coarse to fine and superfine quicker by spending time on a middle stone. Otherwise, I'm going to be spending much more time on my finer stone. So that's generally why we suggest 3 grits of stones. Okay. But these do wear in, so when you first get them, they're very coarse and you think, oh boy, I bought the wrong grit. They break in. So it's got diamonds, sharp diamonds, sticking on the surface. So if that is the surface, you've got that. And in time, that will break off, that will break off, that will break off, that break off. So any diamond stone has what we call a break-in period. So you take a little while, it's going to stay coarse until such time as you've worn it in, you've broken those diamonds away, and then get to a point where it will settle down, and then it gives you what you know it will give you as far as coarseness will go. Problem with them, though, is eventually this happens. So they wear in, you use them, and then they wear out. The advantage of that is my 400 stone now becomes my 600 stone, my 600 stone now becomes my fine stone, and my fine stone becomes my super fine stone. And then all I replace is my coarse stone. I did mention that I have a coarse stone dedicated specifically to flattening the back of hand planes and so forth. My coarsest coarse stone is probably at the point where I can now use it as a coarse stone and then move my coarse into middle into fine, although my fine stone is really, really fine, so I probably wouldn't move that on. But that's the other disadvantage of them. The good news is most woodworkers will hardly ever get to this point. I did mention earlier, we've got Easy Lap, DMT are the major manufacturers. You do have the option for the thin plates. Do keep in mind, there's a reason they're cheaper. They don't use a lot of metal that they coat it to, so they do flex. You need to stick it to something, otherwise it will go like this, one. And second of all, their technologies that they use to attach the diamond is not as robust. So they'll wear quicker than other stones. Okay? But they'll still last you a good 4 or 5 years. My sets of stones that I have, I'm now 5, 6 years down the line, and they still get my blade sharp. So I would rate that as, of all of them, the best option. It is the cheap, more expensive one to get into. The cost of entry is a little bit higher, but it's really worth the funds if you have it. And believe me, Scary Sharp is quickly going to catch up with the rest. And a lot of guys who promote the Scary Sharp, I think Axe Minister, you guys should speak to them. Axe Minister actually has a kit where they've got float glass, thick float glass, and then you stick the 3M, what do you call it? And it's actually the whole surface of the 3M sheet is double stick, and the lapping sheets, they're really good. They work really, really well, and they last much longer than sanding paper, so it's more cost effective. Of course, being very fine, very well made lapping plates, 3M stuff isn't necessarily cheap. It is going to cost you a little bit more to replace them. So you need to weigh up the cost-benefit equation and decide what's best for you. I will always go to diamond stones. Okay, I'd like to dabble again in Japanese stones again, see how sharp I can get a blade. Scientifically, the sharper you can get blade grit-wise, the longer they say it retains the edge. My argument is, if it costs you 5,000 Rand and half an hour at the stones, I'd rather spend 1,000 Rand and be at a level of sharp which is good enough for me within 2 minutes. I'm a professional woodworker, not a hobbyist, so I can't afford to actually go for super sharp. Okay, sharp enough is good for me. And remember, if you're super sharp and you're planing our friend Rhodesian teak, 3 swipes, you're where I was when I started. That's also why I leave my hand planes upright. Because a lot of you guys are cringing. Hand plane should be on its side. That's another long discussion. Okay, so yeah. Then you have options like newly available, INL or Tomek. They are mechanical sharpeners, and honestly, I wouldn't suggest them unless you have deep pockets and you can afford all the jigs, unless you are an active turner who needs to hit specific angles consistently. And guys, if you look at the price of turning tools, you'll fall flat on your back. And a bowl turner will use a bowl gouge a year. Okay, so that's 1,500 for a good tool, 1,500 down in the drain even before you start turning, because you're constantly sharpening your turning tools. And something like a Tormac or the INL, because you can set the angles with the jigs consistently every time, you are removing a lot less material than me, who's running to my grinder doing it freehand. Now, a lot of guys promote freehand sharpening and turning tools. I don't sharpen turning tools enough to develop the body mechanics, the muscle memory to be able to do that. And there, something like an INL or a Tormac is absolutely brilliant. Because the wheel runs in water, it's cool, so you don't risk burning your tools. However, if you want to reshape the primary bevel of any one of your tools and you haven't invested in their coarsest diamond wheel, you think flattening a back is going to take a long time. Okay? There's guys who promote it. They take their chisels and then they hit them on the ends and they say, Tormac isn't so slow. See, I can do it in 2 minutes. Guys, I've tried to re-establish bevels at a customer's house for turning tools, and half of the day's class was spending on the Tormac trying to re-establish a bevel. It's nowhere near as efficient as using a grinder. After you've established the bevel, and you're not going to do that, and you're only using it for sharpening and honing your blades, by all means, it's a really, really good option if you can afford it. I'm not familiar with the INL, so I don't know how it works. It's not been in the market long enough to have enough reviews in place to tell you how it works. But if you can afford a Tormac and you turn, go for it. It's really a good option. Okay? And you can do, I mentioned to the gentleman earlier, I'm going to use I want a Tormac because I turn. I really want a Tormac. And I also carve. I've started whittling. Started carving little teddy bears and birds and that stuff. And like, those chisels are very small and carving chisels are tricky to sharpen by hand. And even tricky for me that can do it. And I believe something like a Tormac is able to consistently keep your angles a little bit better than doing it freehand. So those would be the reason why. For my wife's benefit, the reason would be that I'll be sharpening her knives. That would be my excuse, but it would be for me. So yeah. So those Tormek, Einel, I can't make any claims. I do know that the Tormek wheels fit on it.
Yeah, some of the accessories as well.
Yeah.
We haven't fully tested them ourselves.
Okay.
But it has got the same rod system on it.
I'm able and willing to offer my time, expertise, and space to do that for you. Just let me know when I can collect. So, and that's it. That's the theory. Let me just go through my notes and see if I've covered everything. At the bottom of your notes, you'll see you've got 3 QR codes. One is my website. That will take you directly to my website. 2 is my business card. I've got an electronic business card with all the links and stuff available there. You can sign up for my newsletter there if you like. And then I've got an article where I detailed and a lot of detail exactly what we discussed today. If you haven't signed up for one of my tiers, my access tiers, you won't have access to my blog. You need to register as a customer to be able to get access to my blog. It's free of charge. And then if you want access to my free building plans, I've got a load of building plans. If anybody who's seen me with my Moravian workbench, I've now learned I've got the only Moravian workbench plans in metric, because the only other plans are available in Imperial. We've got time. I'll quickly tell you about Imperial. My dad is a fitter and turner, and he worked at Pilkington's glass factory. Was the biggest glass factory in Springs in the Southern Hemisphere. So he was a manager in the managed fitter and turner. Retired. Does woodworking. Spoke to him a while ago, and he says to me, "Yeah, we were talking about wood or something." He says, "Yeah, it's this big." I said, "Yeah, it's about an inch." And there's this dead silence on the other side of the phone. "You there?" He says, "Yes." And we're talking. I said, "Yeah, it's about an inch." He says, "What?" I said, "It's about size, the width of an inch. It's about 25 mils." He says, "What?" When he was doing his trade, the law was instituted that we moved from imperial to metric. It's against the law, I don't know if it's still the case, in engineering shops and so forth in South Africa to use imperial. And when the law was promulgated, if an inspector came into your workshop and found anything in inch, they would fine you. So me talking in inches to him was a bit of a surprise. But as woodworkers, we build a lot of stuff from plans that come from the US. If we watch videos, they talk in inches. Very few actually go through the trouble of converting one or the other. So to some extent, as somebody working in a metric world, we've been forced to adopt imperial to some extent if you want to use plans and stuff like that. So what I've actually done is all my plans are both in metric and inch. So I convert. I design in metric, I convert in inch. So one of the tiers you can actually get free access to free plans. I am going to change it in the next coming weeks, where I am going to remove the requirements to get access to my blog that you need to sign up as a customer. I'm going to remove that and provide free access to all my articles. As a business owner who runs a website, I also know that SEO is really important for Google, and putting it up behind a paywall has screwed up my SEO completely. I think I've lost anywhere between 25 and 30% of my website traffic as a result of that. So I'm going to remove that paywall. However, if you want my free plans, you still need to sign up. That's a shame. That was a shameless plug. Oh yeah, QR codes. If you scan the QR codes, you'll get access to all of that information. For those who've signed up for my newsletter, that is in my distribution list, and you will get my newsletter, and I'll give you links to articles and interesting stuff that I found on the internet and tell you more what I'm busy with at the moment. I do one-on-one training, so if you're interested in receiving one-on-one training on any aspect of woodworking, you're more than welcome to go and have a look. I've got all my curriculars on my training page as well, so they're all there. So quicker, then we generally finish. Any questions that we have online before we sign out? Any questions from your side? Anything about hand sharpening that boggles you, bothers you, or you'd like to know? Centurion. Centurion. So I'm not too far away. I do provide lunch too. And you can pet my dogs. I had coffee as well. Yes, absolutely.
Any special instructions for sharpening very narrow chisels, 3mm chisels? Level as well?
Either use a jig or get used to the frustration. Okay. Yeah. So I haven't done a demo yet. So we're not done yet. We still have to do the demo. So the English woodworker's got a nice video about hand sharpening. I am going to need this. And he's actually got as a add-on to that video, a video about sharpening narrow chisels. And his advice is, don't aim for a square edge, cutting edge. He says, sharpen until you get it close enough and leave it at that. I've got a 3mm Narex chisel that I never use because I don't want to sharpen it. I've put it in this. So they've got a narrow blade attachment for this. That works really well. Okay. I stick mine in there, and then I put my hands, everything I have around it, try and keep it as still as I can, and then I sharpen quickly because it pivots within this. Something like this is better because it clamps it. Okay, so something like this is better, but usually narrow chisels are higher. They're not as thin, and that doesn't have the capacity to clamp it. And that's where the modifications and stuff on this comes in. So yeah, I don't know, does that answer your question? Okay, guys, come closer. Let's do a demo quickly. Mind the camera. So I'm going to sharpen one, or any one. So remember I said that, and this is the article that's coming next week. Remember I said that your cutting angle is always going to be 45 degrees. Okay? Unless it isn't. This hand plane, the bedding angle, you'll see is much taller or higher than the standard angle planes. Guys, some of you can come behind me as well. As long as you can see me work and not stand in front of the camera. So get in behind me, around this way. Come one, come all. So the bedding angle is 60 degrees. Okay? To the point when I do demonstrations here at the show days, I actually have people playing with this against the grain. You would expect tear out. Glass smooth. Absolutely glass smooth. And I wrote an article last week, took photos and did everything I wanted to do. And when I was taking photos, I had a piece of wood that was badly torn out. Then I planed it with this, took a nice macro shot to show you how good the surface is. And I've always been of the opinion that a cabinet scraper, a Stanley cabinet scraper or Stanley number 80 or Veritas cabinet scraper is more effective at managing tear out. I planed the piece of wood with this. It was glass smooth, so much so that the wood actually shone, that it reflected light. And then I thought, okay, let's compare that to the cabinet scraper, and the cabinet scraper left a worse surface than this did. I love this hand plane. And with your hand around there, the geometry is so comfortable. Because it's a higher angle, it pushes through the wood with much more difficulty, and that's why I have a narrow blade in it. And the geometry on this plane is just absolutely amazing. I love this thing. But that's your bedding angle. Now, what we can do to increase the angle of cut on a normal hand plane is you give your blade a back bevel. So if you have your plane there, you have your secondary bevel, you have your primary bevel, all you do there is you give it a slight back bevel. Okay? Now, that angle there plus your bedding angle 45 degrees is now your angle of your cut. So just by adding a back bevel on your plain blade, slight one, it doesn't need to be much. I took a photo of the one. It's barely the width of a pin. Okay, not even a millimeter wide. Gives me a higher angle of cut. And now I've got a plane that I can use on reverse grain or to fix tear out. And that's the only one that I use, the blade, the only one that I use a jig for, because I want to maintain my bevel of 17 degrees there. Okay, so back bevel will work. And you don't even need to have a second plane. Just get an extra blade, have a back bevel on it, and put the back bevel on every time you've got reverse grain or tear out. Really, really efficient way of doing it. Of course, the best option is to learn how to use a scraper. Who knows how to sharpen a scraper?
By the Veritas jig.
Huh? The Veritas one works. I can't get mine to work for some of the other obscure reason. I do it better with a burnisher. Okay, but yeah, cabinet or a card scraper. Yeah. Even I use my scrapers, the thin ones. I reshape them round to clean the inside of my spoons, carving spoons, or the spoons that I carve, or the ones that's very thin you can flex. And if I shape my tool handles, I use rasps, coarse rasps. I flex it around these corners here. It gets rid of all those marks and it shapes them very nicely. Chair makers use something they call a chair devil. Effectively, it's a scraper that is in the body. Veritas makes them new. Otherwise, you need to make your own. It's in a spoke shave body. It looks like a spoke shave body. And the scraper's actually got hollow like that. And that fits around your chair legs. So you can even out your chair legs. It's called a chair devil. See, I like learning about these things. So I can tell you about it. Okay, so I'm going to use the 3 stones on something. Get that sharp. Let's use the one that we had potting around. Ah, there we go. See, if it was a snake, my mother would say. I'm going to sharpen that by hand. I'm going to show you how quickly that is. And then the other one here is I'll be able to use in a jig, and I'll show you how this is used. Guys, not cheap. Not cheap at all. But if you're going to be just sharpening occasionally, every so often, and you don't want to bother getting used to using it freehand, and I think this kit is similar in price than you would buy this. My biggest problem with this kit, and I told the gentleman, what was his name from ex-minister? That was you?
James.
James. I told James, I love this thing. I've written 2 reviews and I've done a video on my YouTube channel on exactly how I use it. Comes with everything. You need one of these to use it. The settings and everything is for one of these. Guess what's the one thing they don't include in the kit? The jig. Makes no sense. You can even buy this kit without a stone, because you can put other stones in here. And if you want to improve this, I would do that. I would add a coarse stone, a really coarse stone to this. Originally, I thought I would add a fine stone, but the jump from this and this is actually not bad. So I would actually add a coarse stone to this kit if I'm going to add anything. And if you take that out, they fit. And the only reason you have this is because you've got the 2 sides. So really nice. And you get the strop and everything. And guys, that's the extent of the instructions. You don't even get a book with it. That's your instructions. Just don't swap your angles for plain blades and chisels. Okay? Don't ask me how I know. I know. Okay? The one that says, and it even tells you here, 25 degrees, primary bevel, you use the 400 grit. 30 degrees secondary bevel, you use the 1000 grit, and 45 degrees for difficult grain. I wouldn't go for on the primary bevel or a secondary bevel 45 degrees. I've never tested it. I'd rather use a back bevel. They also call it a York pitch. Guys, don't confuse the Charlesworth trick, because it gives you a very shallow angle. When I explained the Charlesworth trick, it's not a York pitch. York pitch is much, much, much steeper than, and that's one of the arguments guys use against the Charlesworth trick, because don't you add a back bevel to the blade, the angle is so shallow that effectively it's not a back bevel. Okay, freehand. This is how simple it is. The wider the blade is, the easier it is to do. If you're looking at the old Stanleys, very narrow blade, so it's difficult to feel for the primary bevel. Say again?
Just move the plane.
What's in the bottle?
Say again?
What's in the bottle?
My super secret juice. Or for you guys, window wash liquid. Okay? Any window wash liquid, it's got a cleaning solution in there, but the primary reason I use this is that it doesn't have any water in there. It's a solvent based. So no water in there. Because there's no water in there, I struggle less with rust. That's metal, it will rust. Metal, it will rust. So using that is a little bit better. If you really want a messy situation, use oil. Some would say you use a light, either you get special honing oils or light machine oil. Don't use oil on this. It doesn't get rid of the swarf effectively. It gunks up. It's just a mess. Use something like this. And if you can't get your hands on something like window wash liquid, just do it dry. Really. But this is to actually get the swarf out. Remember, Japanese stones, you want the swarf and the stuff to be there. You want the slurry to be here. Here you want to get rid of it. Now this is going to get dirty. My wife says every time I sharpen, I smell like metal. And then I say to her, but I thought you liked Iron Man. I think it's more about the guy in the suit than the smell. So you will be removing metal. Your hands get dirty. You can see here, my hands get dirty. All my hand planes, this is just an extra tip. All my hand planes, at least once a week. Well, when I use them. After I sharpen them, I'll coat them with a light coat of oil. Rag in a can, Mr. Paul Sellers. Okay, he's got a video now how you make it. You take an old rag, put it in a can, you roll this up really, really tight, so much so that you need to have a screwdriver to push it in. Okay, don't do this with a screwdriver, by the way. Okay, careful of your hands. It's going to take a lot of force to get this in, but really tight. And then you start soaking this with 5-in-1 or light machine oil or something like that. And that will penetrate in there, it will soak it completely, and that is now an oily surface. And every now and then, I just recharge that. Paul Sellers actually uses this on his bottom of his hand planes when he works. That allows the plane to glide over the wood better. It really does work, but because I use mine every time after I sharpen it, this turns black because I'm getting all the metal shavings and stuff on this. If I put that on my hand plane now, and I've got a really nice piece of pristine maple, guess what's going to happen to my really pristine piece of maple? It's going to have metal impregnated into the wood itself. So I don't put that. What I do have is I've just got a wax candle that I've broken in half, and I just wipe the bottom of my hand planes. And that's the way that certain people on the internet does that. I know that they've got a special thing that looks like a lipstick or a lip balm tube that you screw out and you use that. You don't have to buy it. Candle wax will work. Don't use crayon wax, by the way. They've got colors in them. So remember that nice piece of maple. Okay, so, but that works very well, and that's what I use. If I'm doing the back, I'm just going to show you. So I have the plane blade hanging over the back, and I focus on working on only a small piece. Now you can see how tippy it gets. Okay, so some level of hand strength is useful. Okay, I used to do rock climbing, so I've still got relatively strong hands, but I put even pressure, and I put my right hand or your left hand, depending on what your dominant side is, I contribute with the pressure, and my right arm now becomes my engine. Okay, if you guys want to know how much pressure you want to put, who wants to know how much pressure? Right. Put your hand there and I'll show you. I won't come close to you.
Go on, press, man, press.
That's it. That's how much you need. Anybody else?
Not much. No.
Okay.
No, no.
Yeah. That will not deform a South African grape. Don't know about grapes outside of South Africa. Maybe if it's about 2 months old, possibly, but that's about how much. You don't need a lot of pressure. In the case of diamond stones, more pressure is less effective. Okay, and because you don't need that much. It's aggressive enough so that you don't need that amount of pressure to be able to remove metal. And the contrary is the more pressure you push down, the more you abrade the diamonds, the quicker you wear your stones. And I'm guilty. I do it. to the point where I flex. As I've explained earlier, I flex my blade. Okay? Often I'll stand and I go and I go. And I have this little bit that doesn't want to go away. And then I sort of, okay, let's relieve the pressure. It works. Okay? Can be done. So, modern blades are thicker. Because they are thicker, you find the primary bevel. And I'll show you now why finding the primary bevel is important. It's easier to find the primary bevel on a thicker blade. On a thinner standing blade, it's a little bit more sensitive. You learn more. There is a trick that you can use to find the edge. But now I'm not working on my primary bevel. Remember, I'm just sharpening. So I tilt it until I find the bevel. There's the bevel. It's flat. I can find that it pops up and down the other way. I can feel it. Okay? You guys can come and feel it when we're done. So I feel for it. Then I pop up my elbow. How many degrees is that? I have no idea. I just know it's steeper than 25. Okay? A lot of people will go like this, but that will give you the convex. A lot of people will go like this. Okay? I use circles. Pop it up a little bit. And that's all you need. Okay? You want to feel a burr. Not along the edge, across the edge. You'll feel there's a burr. It's heavier on the right-hand side than the left-hand side. Sometimes I tend to press harder on one side of the blade than the other side, and that makes it skew across. It doesn't matter. Chisels have to be square across as much as you possibly can. Remember, you're working square into joints. Hand planes, it's not that important. You've got a lateral adjuster. Okay? So you can adjust the blade's parallel edge to the sole of your hand plane. Now, that burr is too big. The one you feel there is too big. Often I can see a burr because of the reflection of the light before I can feel it. That burr is too big. This stone is brand new, still very aggressive, but that burr is too big. Okay, on the back of the blade. Not the primary bevel, back of the blade. But that burr is too big. One could also argue if I had it any smaller than that, most of you wouldn't be able to feel it. But you can feel it's heavier on the one side than the other side as well. Eh? Guys, your touch is incredibly sensitive. You would be shocked at how much material you'll be able to feel between two surfaces. And that's why woodworking is such a touchy-feeling thing. I'm constantly touching stuff. But that burr is too big. Then we go to the medium stone. So now I'm bringing those two levels closer and closer and closer together. So the attachment point of my burr to my cutting edge is now becoming smaller as I'm using finer material. And at some point, ideally on this stone, I want that burr to break off. Okay? Now, one of the tempting things to do is to actually work the burr and wipe it off. But because it doesn't break off naturally on your finest stone or on your strop, it doesn't separate cleanly on almost an atomic level, if you will. If I'm breaking it off, I now have serrations. It's like taking that Coke can and doing this. Okay? I don't want to do it. I want the burr to break off automatically. And because I've now got a big burr, I need to work a little more. But the risk is the more I work on the stones, the bigger the burr is going to get. So be patient. So if you feel the burr now, go over to your other stones. We can use a technique a little bit later that we call chasing the burr. So we can go back and forth until we do the same as we do with the Coke can, break that off. Okay. Now we go to the medium stone. Same thing. Talking so much, I'm going dry. So I find the cutting edge or the primary bevel. I pop it up. Now my body gets used to the amount that I pop it up. Okay? What happens with me is I pop it up and now I'm not feeling a burn. Then I think, okay, I need to go steeper. And then I go steeper and steeper and steeper. And that's typically what happens to my secondary bevels. So I often reset my primary bevel, not because my secondary bevel gets too big. It's because it gets too steep. because of me lifting it more and more and more every time I sharpen. Another thing that I didn't demonstrate, I did mention that I don't use a camber. I do what we call breaking the corners. Okay, I break the corners. And the way I do that is I've got the primary edge, cutting edge, I lift up, I bring it down, bring it up the other side, bring it down, and now I've taken the corners away. And the reason I take the corners away is when I'm planing a piece of wood, I don't want the corners to dig into the wood and leave tracks. And that's one of the main reasons a lot of guys will camber their blades, is because you don't get the tracks, but it's also easier to push a cambered blade through wood. And that's why if you have a scrub plane that removes a lot of material quickly, often they're heavily cambered. And that is because you can go for a much deeper cut without getting too much resistance in the cut.
Because this is South Africa, you don't want to use a high corner.
Yeah. So now we go to the second stone, middle stone. You can hear it's not that coarse. Go up. Corners. And remember, the corners don't need to be sharp. You just want to get them out of the way. Okay? So you do the corners here and here and here, and you don't need to worry about them here. They're not going to be sharp. They're not cutting. Okay, I'm dragging the liquid back because I want a pool of liquid here. This is the other technique that I use. As I push the blade up, often I can see as the two surfaces meet one another, it forces the liquid out from my cutting edge. And I use that a lot when I use a narrow blade where I can't see where the primary bevel is. So I will start low down, I will bring it up, and I see the liquid being pushed out from under, and then I just pop it up from there. Okay. Hopefully, the burr isn't gone. So I'm going to try that again. So I want the burr, ideally, to break away at this point. That's too big. These stones are still coarse. So they are, even on the fine stone, it's removing metal. Yeah, so it's not removing that burr as I would want it. The finer the stones get, the more likely you are to remove the metal. So now you can see, now these stones are coarse. So you'll see the cutting edge. Just send it around quickly. Don't feel anything. Look at the cutting edge. See the serrations. You can clearly see the serrations on the cutting edge. Now, when I use my stones, my own stones, my finest stone is so fine that I start seeing a polish. This one, you still see the serrations. So these stones need to be broken in. Now, I'm not saying don't do any woodworking until such time these are broken in. Use them. Sharpen them. As you sharpen them, they will improve over time. Okay, don't spend a weekend breaking in your stones just because you want a polished edge. Work. Build something.
I have oil stones that are impregnated with oil.
Yeah.
Can I use the window washing liquid on them?
No.
No.
So if you're using one or the other, don't mix them, because your oil won't be dissolved in this. Window wash liquid, guys, internationally, let's say US and Europe, you will only ever get this. In South Africa, you'll also get the stuff that's got ammonia in it. Okay? It will burn your nostrils and your lungs and shorten your life, as if inhaling wood dust wouldn't. But don't use the ammonia stuff. Avoid them. So I buy them in 5 liters and just put them into the squirt bottle, and I use them like that. But you'll see the serrations on the cutting edge. That is not a clean cutting edge. So when I go over to the strop and I use the strop, now I'll still have the burr in the back. So I want to remove that burr. So I'll do the back. Then I go to my secondary bevel and go back, go secondary bevel, go back, go secondary bevel. And that's what they typically call chasing the burr. So I'm chasing that burr until such time as it breaks off naturally by itself. Is that sharp enough? Yes, it is. But it's not going to leave you the cleanest edge, cleanest surface possible.
Obviously, that's homemade. This
What?
is strop.
Strop is homemade? Yes.
Okay, now what kind of leather do you use?
Whatever you like. Whatever you like. So there was another question as well.
What grip is?
This is fine. I don't know micron-wise.
No grid on it.
I think EasyLab has started. The EasyLab has done one of two things. They've either started stating the grid or they've gotten another finer stone. One of the two, I'm not exactly sure. DMT also has, DMT doesn't, the EasyLab says coarse, medium, fine, extra fine. But they don't put it against a number. Okay, DMT uses numbers, 400, 800, 1,000, 1,500. But neither of them on their packaging actually states a micron coarseness. This one, supposedly the cheap one, actually does state a micron coarseness. So that's where that, so I think what I will do is in my newsletter, I'll actually post a link, if I remember. I still couldn't remember the second thing I wanted to talk about when I was speaking earlier. But if I'll share that link, and that states the microns, which is quite useful. Where's my blade?
The coating there, well,
So coating here is, okay, coming back to the kind of leather. So a lot of guys, apparently the ideal leather is tanned with vegetable oil. So they call it vegetable oil tanned leather. We're lucky in South Africa. We've got a ready supply of leather. You will not believe how hard it is for other countries to find leather to do this kind of stuff. But oil tanned leather is hard, it's not flexible. It's usually quite thick, and they do it from pork, I think. So, and that's got a very dense grain. Okay, so a lot of guys like using that. Then a lot of guys swear by using the suede side. I use the suede side. Two reasons. One is it takes honing compound much easier than a smooth surface. That's the one thing, and it's a little bit more forgiving if you don't hit the secondary edge, because now I need to find my edge. It's a little bit more forgiving in finding the edge to hone it, but, and this is why a lot of guys don't like using strops, because it rolls up. So what happens is, if I'm using it, because it's flexible, it's not flat like the stone does against this, so it rolls up over the edge. And if I turn my hand around, I'm now rolling my acute edge and I'm making my blade blunt. So, but I also don't have to focus as hard at finding the necessary, because I'm using its negative trait into my advantage, but if I overdo it, I can screw it up. And that's one of the reasons why the guys generally suggest that you don't use the suede side. As far as honing compounds go, you guys have some honing compounds for your carving tools. Toolcraft, different numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The lower the number, the coarser it is. Okay, remember, I'm not wanting to shape the bevel, I want to polish and hone the bevel. So I've actually gone to level 6, which is their finest, but I find that that is not very efficient in taking away material, so I need to spend more time getting a cutting edge, so I've downgraded to a number 5. I've got strops, I've got more strops than you probably would believe, but some strops I've got number 6 on, some strops I've got number 5 on, because on my carving tools I want to have as fine an edge as I can, so then I have a number 6. That one's green. And all you do, and I loaded this one last night, in prep for today. So all you do is you put this on, and you coat the whole surface. And believe it or not, this looked like this last night. And I sharpened 3 blades on it, and it went black. And the reason it goes black, it's got an abrasive. Abrasive removes metal, and the black that you see is metal, which I have on my fingers, and I smell like. Now I'm chasing the burr. I always, even though I only flatten once the back, I always polish the back. It's habit. So I do a few strokes, and you'll see this I've made. This goes into my doggle on my bench. That fits into my doggle, and that sanding paper just stops this from happening. The reason I have it high is to do my draw shave, so I can have my draw shave flat, but I also want to be able to get my hands in underneath without knocking my knuckles. So Leather has grain. Going one way, you flatten the grain. Going the other way, you lift it up. So I always go with the grain because that allows me to take the honing compound, but also not raise this up. Because if I raise it up, I now have a coarser surface that I'm working on. So I'll do that. And you can see the color changing as it removes metal. I'll turn this around and at least 15, 20 times, I'll do this. Now, what I'm doing is I'm dragging across and I'm lifting away. I'm not dragging across and tilting up because then I'll roll the edge. Also, what I've seen, the gent who was in my classes, he came off the edge and it drops down. And that actually screwed up his edges. And a lot of his hand planes, when we sharpened and planed with his hand planes, I felt striations on the metal. And when we checked his hand planes, all of them had some nips and dings. And he said to me, yeah, they do a lot of work with pallets, and he might be hitting nails. I said, do you hit not a lot of nails? And he says, no, not as far as he knows. And what we found is as he pulled off, he was hitting the base of the strop, and that was actually causing dents and damage on his cutting edge.
What color craft do you recommend?
So this is white, that's number 5, or green.
I've been using green, so is that
Yeah.
fine?
Green is finer, and I find that it doesn't take metal off as quickly as I want it, so it takes a little bit longer to get the fine edge, although you end up with a finer edge. But once again, yeah. And that's what they did with this kit. This 1000 stone is relatively coarse, and I thought, yeah, one thing this kit needs is a finer stone, because you need to spend a little bit more time here to get rid of the serrations. But I did a little bit of research on their website, and this is much coarser than this. Cuts much faster. So the guys were actually clever. Because you don't get a lot of striations here, you actually get a cleaner edge here because this is coarser. You might not get it as fine an edge as we do here, okay, but it works, so without needing to tweak it. And because this works so well together, I've changed my opinion of this, and for flattening stones and re-establishing your primary bevel, I would suggest if you're going to add a stone to this, add a coarse stone to this system. I'm constantly feeling for the burr. It is gone. I want to get a decent polish on it. It's still there. I can see it. Okay. What you may sometimes do is go to your finest stone, then get rid of the burr. So you do the back, and then you go back to the strop. And the reason why you go to your finest stone is you don't want to scratch the back that you had worked so hard at polishing and honing. But this is not coarse enough for me to get rid of the burr. The burr was too big because I either lifted up too far, spent too much time on the stone, or the stones are too coarse. These stones are brand new, so they're very coarse. So sometimes you may need to go back to your fine stone on the back. Not flatten it again, just get rid of the burr. Now that burr had to go somewhere, so it probably went to the primary bevel. So that's why I'm working on the primary bevel. Okay. Now, the joke is, we weren't able to shave earlier. Now I've just freshly sharpened it. Imagine the egg on my face. Okay.
Right on your face.
I can't see well enough. So you guys might have noticed the striations when I sent it around first time off the stones. Look how shiny that is now. And that's just strop. Okay.
What's your purity if you use the strop?
Too much.
Much more than that.
Yeah. So on the strop, I'm quite vociferous when it comes to the strop, but probably more than I need to.
Bill, I think you forgot to mention about the blue pen marking on the...
I didn't. In the beginning, I said when you re-establish, so you have the blue pen and you remove metal, you check where you remove the metal, and then you adjust the... I can explain it again, though, if somebody wants to know. Okay. Now we go over to this one. So I've written two. They got it especially for me to try it out for stocking in the shop. I love it.
Dylan, I have to go. I'm not being disrespectful, but
Yeah, so he says. Nice to see you again. Have a good one. Everything you need. So often what you'll see is when guys say to you or explain to you how to use these, you make your own little jig with a stop and you've got your distances. Because if you look at the side, it says for chisel, your projection needs to be this amount of millimeters away from the front edge to your cutting edge to hit a certain angle. Remember, they calculated from the bottom of your little wheel. And because your chisels are deeper, it's a different angle and so forth, and that's why you've got different sides for plain blades and chisel blades. Then you make your little stop and you've got it somewhere in your workshop, and then you go and measure and you adjust it, what have you. Everything is included here. So that's your 25 mil, that's your 30 mil. If you're going to use 45, that's for your chisels. So it's really an all-in-one system. Okay. The feet on the bottom of it, okay, really solid. This phenolic base, it's not going to warp and bend, so that's really, really cool. All your instructions are there, and step by step, and then it tells you what your angles are and what grits you need to use to be able to use it. I'm first going to work on the primary bevel. So this one's I've already done the back, and you'll see here that it's got faceted. So I did reset the bevel, and then I used that to create just another bevel to show you guys what it looks like, but I wasn't in the mood to recreate everything. So on the 25, I'm going to color all of it. This is not a permanent marker though, so I don't know if it's going to work. Careful when you can use the coloring trick as well. If you're hand sharpening something and you want to see what your technique looks like, just don't do it on a whetstone, okay, with this liquid. Even though it's a permanent marker, the liquid washes it off. So you can't see where you're removing metal. So always when I want to use a marker and I use it on my normal stones, I do it dry. Because then I can see it doesn't wash away. So you can see there, that's relatively accurate on 25 degrees. Okay, so how do you set it? Now, I found a way around this, and I'm doing a video at some point. So I've got a long list of videos. I've got about 10 months worth of material to work on. So your plane goes, or chisel goes in there, just remembering which side is in front. Now, this is low. I can't, this is in the way. So on the Axminister video, the guy actually lifts it up and then he does this to measure the distance. For me, that's a real pain in the rear end. So I just hang it off the edge of my table. There is another way that you can do it. You guys are the first to see it. You turn it around. Then you've got enough space. You've got that enough space, and you can do it that way. Of course, when you have a blade that is significantly thicker, you don't have that little edge at the bottom to register against, so nothing's perfect. But that works. So that goes in there. Okay. I usually have a screwdriver at hand, and because I didn't bring my metal planes, I don't have my screwdriver with me. Okay, you tighten that up. Also, don't over tighten it. Why? Because you can cup the metal. Okay, so don't over tighten it. So that is now set 25 degrees. I should now hit 25 degrees. Okay, so let's sort of prove it. So on the internet, they'll tell you to do this. I like doing this because I like having my thumbs. Okay, my thumbs are bigger than my index fingers, so I can cover more area. By the way, guys, if you are sharpening anything and you go through your different stones, I'll show you to you now. You risk damaging the cutting edge. So this is part of it. Put the wheels down, then you tilt your blade down. Don't go like this. This is going to hit your blade. Okay? Do a few strokes. Once again, doesn't take all that much. Now you're not going to feel a burr. We're working the primary bevel. This is the one you do every few often. And actually, I'm not following the instructions. I should be doing it on the coarse stone. That's what the instructions say. Remember, I'm not looking for a fine edge. I just want to remove metal. You use this as well. And try to move your hand plane. You'll see I'm tilting. I'm trying to use as much of my plate as I possibly can. I will even go as far sometimes as turning my plates around, because it just wears my plate evenly across its length and width. Okay, so that is my primary bevel is being nicely shaped, and you can see by the striations, and I'll send this around, you can see the striations run along the long edge of the hand plane, and that's because of the movement here. I will often, if I'm doing it by hand, I will vary the angle at which I'm working on my blade, so I can see, okay, now I'm removing diagonally across, now I'm moving along across, so I know where I am removing metal constantly. So that is 25 degrees. So this you'll do often, well, relatively often, and that now knocks back my secondary bevel, makes it smaller and smaller and smaller every time I do it. But you don't have to do it every time you sharpen. Now we go secondary bevel. Angle is a little bit different. That is now supposedly 30 degrees. That's your 1000 grit. Okay, now I need to be careful that I'm not too aggressive. I'm only hitting a really small part of the blade, so I don't want to end up where I was with an excessively large secondary bevel. So and if your secondary bevel is well established and your setting is consistent here, the closer you are to sharpening your edge. So be careful that you don't overdo it. Burr. Okay, we have a burr.
Because you're going to damage your primary bevel.
Primary bevel doesn't really matter all that much. The issue here is that I'm removing so much material that my burr is very large, which I can't get rid of. And remember, if you're sharpening anything past the fact that it has a burr, you're wasting metal. There's no point at all of removing more metal than the point where you've now created a burr. Remember, a burr is as a result, and I should have drawn the picture, a burr is as a result of removing metal on this surface here and rolling that metal back into the back, and that's what you feel as the burr. Okay, and you'll feel, those who have, it's much, much smaller. I'm not going to send it around to everybody because we are running late, but anybody wants to have a feel quickly? Oh, don't push. Don't push. Okay, so it's a much smaller burr. Okay, hardly feel it. And the advantage of using a jig is if your jig is of a relatively good quality, it will always be across. If you see anything that I've hand sharpened and reset the bevel and stuff, sometimes my secondary bevel looks like it's all skew. As long as the cutting edge is straight, it doesn't matter what it looks like in relation to your primary bevel. But if you use a jig, you'll always see it's nice and symmetrical. Now, what they suggest in this particular, or on the method, is that you remove it from the jig when you go onto the strop. Now, I suggest this for many beginners. Now, it's really hard not to do this, to roll the edge around, and it's really hard to find the correct bevel outside taking it out of the jig. So I suggest is, if you're a beginner, keep it in the jig, but only push in one direction, okay? Because if I push the cutting edge, I'm going to peel my leather off the base, okay? So I'm keeping it in here and only pulling, okay? That's now costing me more work, okay? My favorite strops are long strops. Short strops, you have to go. Long strops, okay? You spend more time on the strop for less work.
And you compound this one the same?
Say again?
You put compound on this?
Compound, yes, but theirs. Okay, the reason I use theirs is because it is coarser and the gap between this and this is not as big as it would be any one of my other compounds. Okay, guys, do as I tell you and show you now, not as I did here. Okay, occasionally I think, well, I'm not thinking, and I push it forward and I slice the strop. That is now sharp. That is sharp. Okay, so party trick just for fun. And you would do the same. I'm going to show you how I do the chisel to give you an idea how quickly it is. Bevel down. So often, if you see second-hand hand planes, the bevel is the wrong way up, and they forced it in there. Where are you? In your case. Okay. A well-made hand plane should be stuck and stable just with hand pressure. Japanese setting hammer, it's brass head, doesn't matter, damage your metal as much. Tap the wedge home and listen to it. You can actually hear it. I've got my fingers underneath. I'm feeling for the blade to come out. Blade is out. It's heavy on this side. Tap it over. Now all of it's back in. Every time you adjust the blade, just tap the wedge back home again because the jar's loose. It needs very little. And this is where I have a piece of wood clamped. Test, clamp, test. Wooden hand planes are harder to set than metal hand planes. Okay? But you can make them yourself. They're much cheaper. And they sound so much better. Can I get it to the clamp? Let's use this one. Oh, okay. Not ideal. This is a metal vise. I always have one of these, about this narrow, and I use it to set the parallel on my blades. So I'll plane across this and bring the blade back, and I start to figure out where I'm taking a cut, so I can very finely set my hand planes. I'm not checking if I'm planing in against the grain. Here it comes up. Okay, this is another discussion all in of itself. Here it comes up, so that is the right direction up to this point. Here the grain is reversing. Okay. Now, softwood, this is pine. Let's see how sharp my blade is. If it's really sharp, we shouldn't see any tear out. Excuse me. Okay, it's chattering. I'm taking a very deep cut. There you can see the chatter. I don't know if you heard it. I'm also getting a significant amount of tear out there. Okay, I'm going to continue with this. Yeah, it's chattering as a result of the reverse. Okay, it's hitting grain against me and it's vibrating. So I want to get a finer cut. So I've pulled the blade back. Now you can get finer cuts by hitting the plane on different areas. Different planes are different. This one I hit in the back. This one just jars it loose. If you are learning how to use wooden bodied hand planes, bring the blade out and start from scratch. Each one of these planes, even metal planes, they have their own personalities. Each one of them. Okay? And believe me, some you will like more than others. Still deep. I think this is still a deep cut. Okay? That's better. That's removing tear out. Okay. Anybody who says you can't do woodworking with one of these, it's telling you pork pies. The thing is it's not so hard to learn. It's really, really not that hard to learn. This one, high angle. I want to show you what it does to the tear out. And that's a thick shaving, eh?
Terrible.
No, actually, no jokes. That's a thick shaving.
But it's impressive.
Much harder to push through. That's a deep cut. I want to let up, so this one's nice. Pop it in the back. That's actually retracted the blade completely. Guess you wonder how I knew that. Huh? Getting there? It's still too deep. Let's see. Much harder to push through. If I skew it a little bit, it's better. And for those standing here, you will not find the tear out. Tear out's gone. Completely gone. Absolutely. Yeah. Tear out's completely gone. This is ready for finish. Okay. The only reason I would sand this is to key the surface if I'm using something like shellac. If I'm using something like a penetrative oil, it's ready to go. Okay. The oil needs to penetrate into the fibers of the wood. Extra tip for you guys. Oil needs to penetrate into the fibers of the wood. Many woodworkers like to sand way smooth. Okay? All the oil manufacturers say minimum 100, maximum 150. Two reasons. Why? Is you need to have open pores for the oil to get into. If you sand any higher than 150, I sometimes sand up to 180. That's when I do sand. Don't tell anybody else I sand. Sometimes do. But when I do sand, if you sand higher than 180, okay, your dust doesn't matter. I don't care what the manufacturer says. You will have dust on the surface of your wood. The dust will get into the pores and you will not get efficient penetration. The reason why this works is top of the straw. I've sliced it open completely. That fiber is as open as it will ever be to accept a finish. The only reason I will sand it is to key the surface if I'm using something like a, you get penetrative finishes, which is your oils, and then you get non-penetrative finishes like shellac and so forth. You do get some penetration, but not to the same level as you get with oil. That is ready to be finished.
Breaking my world. Remember when we were kids and we had to sand our desks in the last day of school? It's like,
It's the same guy who told you to put your hand plane on its side. Same guy. So how quick is it really? Very.
You won't believe I used to put mine on the side.
Nothing wrong with it. So we can discuss it when we're done. Okay? Guys, don't tell anybody else that comes to the expos. Okay? But we stand, I show them the hand planes, and usually the guys will come, they'll test the hand plane, and then very careful. I'll give it to somebody to go home and sharpen it. All of you know how. And then I'll test it, and then they very carefully put it down on its side. And then while I'm talking to the guys, I usually pick it up and I'll pop it down again like this. And sometimes the guys don't notice, and sometimes there's a very real reaction to me doing that. And the main reason why we were taught not to put planes down like so is most of the people who did woodworking in school were boys. Boys are naughty. Okay, I was in a boys' school. So what's the best thing ever? It's nailing nails into the top of the workbenches. Okay? And if you push that thing over the workbench, it's going to hit the nail, and guess who needs to sharpen it? The same guy with the long lot. Sorry. Okay? So you're going to sharpen your blades or give you 6. More likely to give you 6. One of the arguments of not putting a plane down like this is that you will blunt the blade. Okay? If you put it down on a piece of metal or your table saw, okay? Yes. If you put it down on wood, the first time I take it and I start planing something, I'm blunting the blade. Unless I push this thing forward, it's not blunting your blade. You're putting it down straight. In a commercial setting, if I put the plane down like this and I'm in a hurry and I drop it, I adjust my lateral adjustment. Now it's out. My plane blade is no longer parallel and coplanar to the sole of my plane. Okay? So if I'm going to put it down on its side, okay, now I can work with it. If I'm putting it down here and I put it down a little bit hard, the only thing that's going to happen is my cut is going to get deeper. It's the only thing that's going to happen. And if I'm busy here at my vise and I'm planing a piece of wood, I'm planing, It's much more efficient to work that way. And that's why I have no issue with keeping my planes upright. And
If you left your steel rule lying on your table.
yes, that is very much the case. Fortunately, that's the one screw up in my shop I can tell you that never happened to me. But I won't tell you about all the other ones though. So how quick is it really? So let's say we're using a 3-stone setup. Okay, I need to feel these for coarseness. Yeah, you want to confuse me.
Which one's the fun?
Yeah. So how quick is it really? None of that struggles. Okay, so, sorry, I don't want to slice you. So, find the bevel. Chisels are easier. Now, this is my support, my motor. Okay? Front finger there keeps it square. That one keeps the pressure. Those keep the pressure down. This is just something you have to do. Okay? My finger positions are not the same as somebody else's, but I am always resting, the tool in my hand. That's my engine. Okay? Found. Okay? Pop it up. I have a burr. Okay? Remember, I'm now trying to get rid of the burr. I already have one. I don't need to make it any bigger than it is. It's gone. So my best party trick is they usually put me next to the guys of Tormek, and then the time it takes them to put a chisel into the jig, I'm sharp. It's worth spending some time on the strop, and if I go and test it and I find that it's not as sharp as I'd like it to be, rather than go back to the stones, I go back to the strop. If you're using a hand plane and you're struggling with your hand plane with its performance, sharpen the blade. Always start there. Okay? If you put the blade in after you've sharpened it and you're still struggling with this hand plane, sharpen the blade. Okay? And just before you start thinking that it might be the chip brake or anything else, sharpen the blade. Okay? It's going to solve most of your problems. Okay? But that's where a system like this is useful with a jig, because you learn to know what sharp is. That's what the advantage is. Then I always go and I try and pair end grain. And I'm trying to see how cleanly the cut is. That is a horrible cut. This thing is not sharp. Don't be fooled and going across the grain, because that will often cut it really nicely. But you can see there, you need to have, when you do a cut on a cutting tool like this, is the edge that you want, not the edge, the surface that you want needs to be smooth and shiny. So if it's dull in any way, you've got micro serrations where the tool is cut. It will cut, but it's not a clean cut. And that's something I learned from carving. If you sharpen a tool and you make a cut, surface needs to be shiny. So this is bad. This is actually worse than I'd like to admit it is. Let's go on a finer stone and see what happens.
Same pressure as the
Still on the diamond stone, yeah, so it's the
still the
same.
grape.
Yeah, still the grape. Okay, I'm also not hitting the cutting edge. So I'm actually looking at where the light is reflecting. Where you've got serrations and you're removing material, it's going to be duller than the shining edge. Okay? 1970s, early 80s horror movies. How do you know this lady is going to be sliced? The killer walks down the hallway and you've got that glint from the cutting edge. It's a sharp edge. Sharp and polished edge. Okay? Guess who grew up in the time of Nightmare on Elm Street and so forth? He was a favorite. I loved him. I actually loved him. My pencil case. I drew the claws on my pencil case. My teachers thought I was weird. Now my wife just thinks I'm weird. They just don't make them the way they used to. Then horror movies were at some level of humor. Now they're just scary. Can't wait for the new Superman movie, though. Huh? Come on, they've got crypto in it. It's got to be good. No, it's his dog. It looks like Snowy. And I think the new Fantastic Four is going to be brilliant. I like superhero movies. I read comics as a kid. What can I say? That's the only reason I can speak English. Ek is eintlik Afrikaans. Here we go. Even on end grain, clean cut. Once again, end grain, softwood. Yeah. So I saw on a group that I belong to a post the other day of this guy that sharpens up a chisel. Japanese. So once again, we know that they can sharpen anything to a level that is absolutely inhuman. And then the guy takes end grain like this and he slices it. You get this even, no warping, nothing. Just this peel. It looks like paper being peeled off that end grain. And everybody was, wow, rah, 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 rah. Two things. One is they do it on a specific wood species. Two is they wet the end grain. Makes it easier to cut. So, brilliant party trick, and I'm not denying that his blade isn't sharp. I probably wouldn't be able to sharpen it to that level. But they stack the odds in their favor. It's the same with the Japanese competition where they've got these massive hand planes and the one guy pulls and the other one carries the shaving to see how thin it is and how long it is. Look at the species. Also, guys on the internet, let's take a thin shaving. It's usually something like pine or softwood or something like that. The moment it's like oak that's coarse and breaks away, you won't get a shaving 15 meters long. Simply not possible. Do it with maple. There's a few things that are satisfying as planing maple. But 2 minutes, not even, and we're sharp. So, yeah, any questions?
Do you find that honing guide wrecks the surface of a stone?
I find that the stone wrecks my honing guide. So, it doesn't, okay, because it's such a small area. And if you're not putting excessive pressure on it, it shouldn't. And if you keep something like a soft stone, like a Japanese stone, flat constantly, it shouldn't affect it. What I do find on my coarsest stones, because this is brass, it wears my roller. So that's where I find the reverse. But apart from that, no, it doesn't damage your stones.
And doesn't the offset change from honing guide to honing guide?
Yeah. So, only matters if you always exactly want 25 degrees primary bevel. Half a degree bevel between the two doesn't matter. As far as honing guides go, probably the best one available on the market is the Veritas one. Okay. So again, everybody, thank you for coming around. I'm going to be here. If you'd like to, pleasure. If you'd like to ask any questions, you're more than welcome. Don't take too long. There's stuff I want to buy. That's the only reason they invite us to come and do classes. So I found something that I can use for carving spoons down there. But thank you for everybody for joining us. Thank you for everybody online. Jordan, I don't know if you shared the link of my channel. You did?
Yes.
Okay.
In the description, so at my creation.
Perfect. It is recorded, so if anybody wants to go back and re-watch it, record it. But again, thank you. Everybody online, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time. And next time, come and join us. It's fun. And last time I checked the